The body hit the dirt before anyone in Blackstone Ridge had time to blink. Caleb Voss didn't draw slow, he didn't warn. He walked into the Lucky Spur Saloon on a Tuesday afternoon, found the man he believed had cheated his employer out of 300 head of cattle, and put a bullet in that man's knee before the poor soul could finish his sentence. The screaming that followed split the air like something tearing at the seams. Women grabbed children and ran. Men pressed themselves against walls, and Caleb stood over the writhing figure with his boot on the man's wrist, grinding down until bones cracked, and said so quiet the room went still just to hear it, "Where is Elias Vane?" Nobody answered. That was the moment everything in Blackstone Ridge changed. If you've ever watched a man with real power walk into a room, not the power of wealth or words, but the power of a man who has learned to stop fearing consequences, then you know the particular silence that follows. It doesn't feel like quiet. It feels like the whole world holding its breath, waiting to see who bleeds next. That was Caleb Voss. And somewhere out in the desert, riding toward this town with no knowledge of what was waiting, was Elias Vane. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel and follow every part of Elias's story to the end. Hit like and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The desert outside Blackstone Ridge had a way of lying to you. In the early morning, it looked almost gentle, pale gold light stretching over the scrub flats, shadows still long and cool, the air carrying a faint smell of sage that almost made you forget how brutal the afternoon would become. Elias Vane had learned not to trust that gentleness a long time ago. He'd been riding since before dawn, which wasn't unusual. Sleep had never come easy to him, and lately it had barely come at all. He'd spent the past 3 nights camped in a dry wash south of the ridge, not because he was hiding, not exactly, but because he was thinking, and thinking required distance from other people. Raven moved beneath him with the kind of steady rhythm that a good horse develops after years with the same rider, each of them reading the other without effort, without need for signal or command. Elias was 41 years old, though he looked closer to 50. His face carried the kind of weathering that happens to men who spend too many years outside, with too little shelter and too much trouble following them. There was a scar along his jaw that he'd stopped noticing somewhere around his 30s, and his eyes had settled into a habitual squint that gave strangers the impression he was always looking at something just past them, scanning for threats they couldn't see. Most of the time that impression was correct. He was not a man who invited conversation. He didn't walk into towns looking for company or trouble. He came in for what he needed: grain for Raven, maybe a meal, occasionally a drink if the place seemed worth the risk of proximity, and then he left. He had been living this way for 11 years. He had stopped trying to remember what living differently had felt like. Blackstone Ridge appeared on the horizon as a cluster of flat-roofed buildings shimmering in the early heat. He had passed through once before, maybe 4 years ago, long enough to know it had a livery stable that didn't cheat on grain weight and a saloon that kept its whiskey honest. That was enough recommendation for a man with his particular standards. He didn't know what was waiting for him there. He didn't know that a rider had come in 2 days before him, a lean man with flat gray eyes, and a reputation that preceded him like a bad smell, asking questions about a drifter on a black horse. He didn't know that the name Caleb Voss would mean anything to him until it was too late for the knowledge to be useful. Raven smelled it before Elias registered it consciously, a slight change in the horse's pace, a barely perceptible tensing in the shoulders. Elias had learned to pay attention to that. He slowed, not stopping, just easing the pace and lifting his eyes to the road ahead. Blackstone Ridge's main street was quiet, too quiet for mid-morning. A town this size should have had people moving, wagons, noise. Instead, he counted 3 faces visible in windows. Nobody on the boardwalk. The door to the general store was half open and swinging, like someone had left in a hurry. Elias pulled Raven to a walk. He had ridden into enough bad situations to recognize the particular texture of this one. The emptiness wasn't random. It was the emptiness of people who knew something was about to happen and had arranged themselves accordingly, far enough back to be safe, close enough to see. That was human nature. People pulled toward disaster the same way. They pulled toward warmth. He considered turning around. He turned the thought over once, the way he turned over most decisions, without rushing it, without letting emotion crowd in and muddy the reasoning. He was low on grain. Raven had covered hard ground in the last week and needed rest and feed. And whoever was in this town waiting for him because someone was, that much was now obvious. Turning around would only delay the meeting, and delay had a way of making these things worse. He kept riding. The livery was on the north end of the street, which meant he had to pass most of the buildings to reach it. He did this slowly, taking inventory. The saloon on his left had 2 horses tied outside that didn't belong to the sort of men who tied them. Big animals, well maintained. with saddle rigs that cost more than most Blackstone Ridge men earned in a month. Beside them was a third horse, a pale roan with a cut along its flank that hadn't been tended properly. 3 horses, at least 3 men. He noted the second-floor window of the saloon, the angle of shadow that suggested someone standing back from the glass. He noted the narrow alley between the saloon and the boot shop. He noted, without turning his head, the figure sitting in the chair outside the barber shop, a man pretending to sleep, hat low, one hand resting very deliberately near his hip. Elias didn't slow down. He kept his face forward and his shoulders loose, and he rode past the saloon like he hadn't seen any of it. He tied Raven at the livery and handed the reins to the boy who worked there, a 13-year-old named Cody, who usually had a great deal to say about nothing in particular. Today, Cody said nothing. He took the reins, wouldn't meet Elias's eyes, and started toward the stall with his head down. "Grain," Elias said. "Good grain, not the stuff from the back corner." Cody nodded. "Boy," the kid stopped. "How many?" Cody's jaw tightened. He was frightened, which Elias understood, and loyal to his own survival, which Elias also understood. The boy stared at the ground for a moment, then held up 3 fingers without looking up. Elias nodded once, obliged. He didn't go directly to the saloon. That was what they'd expect a man walking in through the front to announce himself, maybe hoping to talk his way through or get the drop on someone while the light was still in his favor. Caleb Voss, whoever he was, had set up this reception with enough thought to position a watcher outside. That meant he wasn't stupid. Stupid men, Elias had found, were dangerous in a simple way. Smart men were dangerous in several ways at once. He walked around the back of the barber shop, keeping to the narrow strip of shade along the building's wall. The alley behind the main street was mostly empty, a few barrels, a broken crate, the smell of garbage and old ash from somebody's burn pile. He moved without hurrying, because hurrying drew attention, and he'd learned that a man who moved with apparent purpose and without apparent anxiety was nearly invisible in most situations. People assumed he belonged wherever he was. He found the back door of the saloon unlocked, which was either a gift or a trap. He stood outside it for a moment and listened. Voices inside low, not relaxed. The particular murmur of men trying to sound patient while actually running out of it. He pushed the door open 6 inches and stayed where he was. The back room was storage barrels of whiskey, stacked cases, a table with a broken leg leaning against the wall. Beyond a curtained doorway, the main room. Through the curtain's gap, he could see a slice of the bar, a pair of boots propped on a table, the pale daylight coming through the front windows. "He ain't coming." That was a young voice, impatient, carrying the slight roughness of someone who'd been talking too long and was tired of it. "He's coming." Different voice. Flat, almost disinterested. "He came into town 20 minutes ago. He's just thinking." Thinking about what? "He doesn't know who we are." "He knows something." "Why do you think the street's empty?" A pause. "So we go get him." "You go get him," the flat voice said, "and you'll come back without your fingers." "Sit down." The young voice went quiet. Elias filed away what he'd learned. There were at least 2 men in the main room, possibly 3, and the man with the flat voice had enough control over the others to tell one of them to sit without argument. That made him the one who mattered. Elias let the back door swing closed without sound and moved back to the alley to think. He went in through the front. Not because he was stupid, and not because he was trying to prove anything. He went in through the front because the back room entry was too narrow and too dark, and because the element of surprise only works if you have somewhere to move when the shooting starts. The front door gave him light, gave him angles, and most importantly let him walk in looking like a man who already knew exactly how this was going to end. The part was something of a performance. But he'd found that certain performances, executed without hesitation, had a way of becoming real. The saloon's interior held 3 men as he'd expected. The young one, late 20s, lean, with a kind of aggressive restlessness that came from not enough experience, and too much confidence, was sitting at a table near the window with his chair turned sideways, legs stretched out. An older hired gun stood at the bar, a hard-looking man in his late 30s, with a missing piece of his left ear, and the blank professionalism of someone who'd done this kind of work long enough to have lost any feeling about it. And at the center of the room, sitting at the biggest table with a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold, was Caleb Voss. Elias recognized the type before he'd taken 3 steps inside. Voss was maybe 45, broad through the shoulders, with gray starting to thread through his dark hair, and a stillness about him that was different from calm. It was the stillness of a man who had learned to conserve movement, because movement cost energy, and energy was better spent on what came after movement. He wore his gun low on his right hip, and he didn't reach for it when Elias walked in, which told Elias more than any of the words that came next. "Elias Vane," Voss said. "Not a question, most days." Elias moved to the bar without being invited, set himself at the far end with his back to the wall and his front to the room. The barman, a heavy, miserable-looking man who clearly wished he were anywhere else, took one look at Elias and then found something extremely interesting to examine near the floor. "You know who I am," Voss said. "Don't know your name. Know what you are." The young man at the window shifted his weight, and the movement was so readable that Elias nearly felt sorry for him. Nearly. "I'm Caleb Voss," Voss said with the particular emphasis of a man who expects his name to land a certain way. "I work for Victor Hale." Elias said nothing. He looked at Voss the way he looked at most things, without hurry, without visible reaction, taking inventory. "Hale's got a bounty on you. $3,500. Voss picked up his coffee cup, looked into it, set it down. "Alive, preferably. He wants to have a conversation." "Hale can come have a conversation himself." "Mr. Hale doesn't travel for conversations with men like you." "Then we've got a problem," Elias said. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that had weight to it, that pressed against the walls of the room and made the ordinary sounds of the towns outside, a wagon passing, a dog barking twice, seem very far away and very unreal. Elias watched Voss. Voss watched Elias. The young man at the window was trying to look dangerous and mostly managing to look anxious. The older hired gun at the bar hadn't moved since Elias came in, which was either professional discipline or the particular paralysis that sometimes gripped men when a situation wasn't evolving the way they'd planned. "You're not what I expected," Voss said. "People say that. They say you're quick." "I'm adequate," Elias said. Something shifted in Voss's expression, not quite amusement, but close to it, the way a serious man might acknowledge a point well made. "Victor Hale says you killed his brother." Elias set his hands flat on the bar. "Hale's brother drew on me first. He drew in front of 6 witnesses, 3 of whom had no reason to lie in my favor. That's fact, not argument. Victor Hale doesn't care about witnesses. Most men with money don't. That doesn't make them right." The young man at the window made a sound something between a laugh and a scoff, the kind of noise young men make when they want to demonstrate that they are not impressed. Elias didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Voss, because Voss was the one who mattered, and because looking at a lesser threat when a primary threat was in the room was the kind of mistake that got men killed. "Here's where we are," Voss said, leaning forward slightly with his forearms on the table. "I've got 2 men with me. You've got nobody. Town is empty because everyone with sense went home. You can come with me peaceful, or you can make this ugly. Either way, I'm leaving with you." Elias considered this. He wasn't afraid, which he recognized as something that probably should have bothered him more than it did. He had stopped being afraid of dying somewhere around the time he'd stopped having much to preserve. What he felt instead was a kind of cold clarity, the same sensation that settled over him in the moments before things went very badly or very well. "Who's the boy by the window?" he asked. Voss blinked once. "That's Donnie. He's good. He's fast," Elias said. "I can see it in how he holds himself, but fast doesn't mean good. Fast means confident. That's different." Donnie's jaw tightened. "I don't need you to explain me." "I'm not explaining you," Elias said, looking at him now for the first time, holding his gaze. "I'm telling you to think about what fast has cost other men you know. Think about whether you've got something worth spending it on in this particular room." The words were quiet. They weren't a threat exactly. They were something worse. They were a question that required honest consideration, and Donnie wasn't at an age where honest consideration came easily. Victor Hale was a name that meant something in the Southern Territories. His cattle operation stretched across 3 counties. His political connections extended further than that, and his capacity for sustained, patient vengeance was the kind of thing that men talked about in careful voices. He had outlasted 3 rivals, 2 legal challenges, and 1 federal investigation, and he had done it without ever appearing to be the kind of man who would outlast anything. Elias had met Daniel Hale, Victor's younger brother, in a town called Cutter's Ford, 18 months ago. Daniel had been drunk and loud and carrying a grudge against Elias that Elias had not been able to fully trace to any source he understood. The man had come at him across a saloon floor with a gun already cleared from the holster, and Elias had put him down before anyone present had fully understood that it was happening. He had not sought the encounter. He had not provoked it. He had, in fact, tried to leave the saloon before it reached that point, and Daniel Hale had blocked the door. None of that mattered to Victor Hale. Elias understood why grief didn't organize itself around facts. It organized itself around absence, and the absence of Daniel Hale sat in his brother's chest like a stone that nothing would move. But understanding a man's grief didn't mean surrendering to his revenge. "I'm not going with you," Elias said. Voss looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected. "I thought you'd say that. Then we should talk about what comes next." "What comes next is already settled." "Nothing's settled until it's finished," Elias said. "That's one of 2 or 3 things I know for certain. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be described differently by every person who witnessed pieces of it. The barman Two women who watched through the gap of a window shade. Old Gus Merritt, who'd fallen asleep in the corner booth and woke up to a world that had rearranged itself, and Cody the stable boy who'd positioned himself outside the saloon's side window with the particular fearlessness of adolescence. The older hired gun at the bar moved first. He didn't draw. He shifted his weight slightly, a preparatory motion, the kind that experienced men make before drawing, because the body wants to balance itself before the arm commits. Elias had been watching for exactly this. He stepped away from the bar and to his left in the same motion, putting the bar stool between himself and the hired gun and turning his angle to the room. Donnie was on his feet, chair scraping back, his hand already moving toward his hip. But Elias wasn't looking at either of them. He was looking at Voss because Voss still hadn't moved. That was the piece that didn't fit. A man directing this kind of operation with two guns ready to fire should have been making his own move. Instead, Voss sat with his hands still on the table, watching Elias with an expression that was harder to read than it should have been. "Call him off," Elias said. "Or what? Or you find out why the stories are true." Something passed across Voss's face brief, gone before it fully formed. But Elias caught it, and what he caught was not quite fear. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who had, in this moment, seen something in front of him that matched something he'd been told about, and was now reassessing whether the information he'd been given had actually been sufficient. "Donnie," Voss said, "hold." The young man froze. His hand was halfway to his gun. He held it there for a moment, suspended between the motion he'd committed to and the order that had stopped him, and Elias watched the frustration move through his face like weather. "I said hold," Voss repeated quieter. Donnie let his hand fall. The older hired gun at the bar, Mason Cole, Elias would learn his name later, had also stopped. He stood with his weight still shifted, the preparatory tension still in his body, but his hand flat against his thigh. The room went quiet again. "You could walk out of here," Elias said to Voss. "All three of you. I'm not going to come after you. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in being left alone, which is a thing I have been interested in for most of my adult life, without tremendous success." Voss looked at him for a long time. "Hale doesn't accept this kind of answer. Then Hale will need to make peace with the world not always running the way he'd prefer. He'll send more men, I know. More than 3. I know that, too." Voss sat back in his chair. The movement was not relaxed. It was the movement of a man under tension trying to relieve it without showing it. "You killed a man named Wesley in Pratt County last fall. Wesley drew on me, a man named George Finch in Territorial. Finch was trying to rob a freighter. I was in the freighter, Harlan Crossin. Cross was drunk and trying to prove something, and he's the 6th man who's tried to prove it, and all of them are in the ground, and I am still here. Which is not something I take pride in, it's just something that's true." Elias kept his voice level. "I am not a man who goes looking for this. That's worth something, even if Hale doesn't see it that way." Voss was quiet for a moment. "You sound like you're trying to convince me of something." "I'm trying to convince you that this ends badly if you push it to the next step." "I don't want that." "You probably don't want that. The 2 men with you almost certainly don't want that." He glanced toward Donnie when he said it. The young man's expression had changed. The aggressive restlessness had quieted somewhat, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like thought. The barman dropped a glass. It shattered against the floor behind the bar with a sound that cracked through the room like a gunshot, and everything that had been carefully held in suspension for the past several minutes detonated in the space of half a second. Mason Cole went for his gun. It was a professional's reaction, pure reflex, bypassing whatever restraint Voss's presence had been maintaining. He was fast. He was genuinely fast, faster than most men Elias had encountered, and in any other circumstance against any other person, fast would have been enough. Elias was already moving. He took 2 steps toward Cole and inside his draw, closing the distance that made speed irrelevant, his left hand coming across to catch Cole's gun arm at the wrist, pushing it and up as the gun cleared the holster. The shot, when it fired, went into the ceiling. Sawdust drifted down. Elias hit Cole hard with his right elbow, a precise strike to the jaw that had nothing elegant about it, and everything practical. The man's knees buckled, and he went sideways into the bar, staying upright but not functioning. Donnie was on his feet and his gun was out. But Elias already had his own gun up, and he was looking at Donnie across 15 feet of dusty saloon floor, and the whole world had reduced itself to that 15 feet and what was in it. Donnie was breathing hard. His gun was up, and his hand was steady, which surprised Elias slightly. He'd expected more trembling from someone who'd never had it come down to exactly this kind of moment. Maybe Donnie had been in moments like this before. Maybe he was just good at controlling himself under pressure. Either way, it was worth noting. "You don't want to do this," Elias said. "You don't know what I want. You want to go home tonight. You want to wake up tomorrow. You want to be somewhere other than this particular room in about 20 seconds. because this room is going to look very different in 20 seconds, and you'd rather not be here for it. I've got a beat on you right now. You've got a beat on me right now, Elias agreed, and I've got one on you. And if we both do what we're considering doing, maybe we both go down, and maybe only one of us does, and neither of us knows which way that falls. You want to bet your life on the odds in this room? Donnie's jaw worked. He was actually thinking, which was more than Elias had expected from him, more than Elias expected from most men his age in a moment like this. Voss had pushed himself back from the table but hadn't drawn. He was watching this exchange with the expression of a man calculating something. Lower the gun, Donnie, Voss said. He's not going to do anything if you lower the gun. You can see that. Another silence, different from the ones before. This one had something fragile in it, the quality of a moment that could tip in either direction, and nobody in the room could fully control which way it went. Then Donnie lowered his gun. He did it slowly, like a man making sure everyone saw the choice he was making. There was something that might have been dignity in it, or something that might have been relief, and Elias wasn't entirely sure which it was and didn't think it mattered. He kept his own gun up a moment longer. Then he holstered it. Cole had straightened from the bar, still dazed, one hand pressed to his jaw. There was blood on his lip. He looked at Elias with an expression that held no readable emotion, no anger, no shame. Just the flat assessment of a professional who had been bested by a better professional and was filing that information away. You'd better ride, Elias said to him. Cole looked at Voss. Go outside, Voss said. Take Donnie. Cole moved toward the door, and after a moment Donnie followed him, holstering his own gun with careful deliberateness. The saloon door opened, and light came in, and then the door swung shut, and they were alone, Elias, Voss, and the barman, who appeared to have developed a significant interest in becoming invisible. Voss looked at Elias across the room. He looked for the first time, like a man who was genuinely uncertain what happened next. What do you want from me? Voss asked. Nothing, Elias said. I told you what I want. I want to be left alone. Hale won't stop. That's between Hale and his choices. Elias straightened his coat. You could tell him what happened here. You could tell him exactly what happened. Not a version of it. Not a story that makes it easier for him to hear. The truth. That might make him think. It might make him angrier. It might, Elias agreed. That's also between him and his choices. Voss stared at him for another long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the table. He'd had it resting there the whole time, brim down, which was a habit Elias associated with men who spent a lot of time in saloons, and placed it carefully on his head. You're a strange man, Vane, he said. I've been told. Most men in your position would have tried to kill all three of us the moment they walked through the door. I know, Elias said. That's generally how it goes. Why didn't you? Elias thought about the question. He thought about it honestly. The way he tried to think about most things without dressing it up, without making it prettier than it was. Because you might leave, he said. And if you leave, then no one's dead and no one's mother is getting a letter this week. And that's better than the alternative, even if the alternative would have been quicker. Voss turned his hat brim once with his thumb, a small unconscious gesture. Then he walked to the door and pushed it open. He stopped on the threshold, didn't look back. I'll tell Hale what happened, he said. I can't promise you anything about what he does with it. I'm not asking for promises, Elias said. Just the truth. The door swung shut. Elias stood in the empty saloon for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. The afternoon light came through the windows at a low angle, catching the dust that still hung in the air from the scuffle, making it look almost beautiful in the way that desert light sometimes made ugly things look beautiful. The barman cleared his throat. You want a drink? Yeah, Elias said. I'll take one. He sat at the bar, and the barman poured whiskey into a glass that wasn't quite clean and set it in front of him without further comment, which was exactly the right amount of conversation for the moment. Elias picked it up and looked at it. His hand wasn't shaking. It almost never did, and he'd stopped being surprised by that. He wasn't proud of it either. It was just one of the ways that years of a particular kind of living changed a man, not always in directions you'd choose, not always in ways that made you better. Just changed. He drank. Outside, he could hear the town beginning to come back to itself, the sounds of movement, of people emerging, of voices checking in with each other, the way people did after something had threatened to be worse than it turned out. A child's voice, a door closing, the ordinary sounds of a place that had held its breath and was starting to breathe again. He thought about Victor Hale, a man he'd never met, sitting somewhere in a comfortable house on a large piece of land, deciding whether a dead brother was worth a continuing war. He thought about Caleb Voss riding out of Blackstone Ridge with 2 men and a report to deliver. He thought about Donnie, who was probably already telling the story the way young men told stories after moments like that, shaping it slightly, adjusting the edges so it reflected better on him, which was what most people did, and which Elias had stopped judging anyone for. He finished his drink. He set the glass on the bar and reached for his coin and put enough money down for the whiskey, and a little extra for the glass that had been broken and the trouble the barman hadn't asked for. There were decisions coming. He could feel them the way you could sometimes feel weather before it arrived, not specific, not detailed, but there in the texture of the air, in the particular weight of the afternoon. Victor Hale wasn't finished. Voss had said as much, and Voss was a man who told the truth because he'd been doing this long enough to understand that lies made difficult work harder. More men would come. Elias put his hat on and stood. Through the front window of the Lucky Spur Saloon, he could see the main street of Blackstone Ridge, slowly returning to its ordinary shape, a woman coming out of the dry goods store, two men talking near the water trough, the livery boy Cody peering around the corner of the building with enormous eyes, and probably the beginning of a story he'd be telling for years. Elias watched all of it. He watched with the quiet attention of a man who understood that ordinary life had a value precisely because it was fragile, and that the people moving through it didn't always know how close they stood to the edge of something that would change everything. He pushed the door open and walked out into the sun. Raven was still in the livery. He would need to check on her, make sure Cody had given her the right grain and the right water, because Raven was the one living thing in the world that hadn't let him down yet, and he had strong feelings about maintaining that record. And after that, there were decisions to make about Victor Hale, about whether to stay still and let the next confrontation come to him, or to move to ride toward the source of this, to put himself in front of the man behind the bounty, rather than waiting for the bounty to keep coming. Elias Vane had been running from one version or another of this situation for 11 years. He had not made up his mind in that quiet afternoon in the Lucky Spur with whiskey settling in his chest that he was finished running. But he had begun to wonder, as he walked into the heat of the day with the whole town watching him from behind curtains and corners, whether the time for that particular way of living was finally coming to an end. He walked toward the livery without hurrying. Behind him, the door of the saloon swung shut on its hinges. The town held its breath one more time. Then it let it go. Cody didn't go home that night. He was supposed to. His mother had made that clear enough before he'd left for the livery. That morning, be back before supper, she'd said, "Don't get into trouble," which was the kind of instruction that landed differently on a 13-year-old boy who'd just watched a man walk into a saloon alone against 3 armed bounty hunters and walk out again like he'd done nothing more remarkable than order a meal. Cody sat on an overturned bucket outside the livery well past dark, thinking about that. He'd watched through the side window, or tried to. The angle was bad and the glass was dirty, but he'd caught enough. He'd seen Donnie come out first, jaw tight, not looking at anyone. Then Mason Cole, touching his face with 2 fingers, testing the damage. Then Voss last, adjusting his hat, moving to his horse with the deliberate calm of a man who was pretending the last hour hadn't happened. None of them had looked back. Cody turned that over in his mind. He was at an age where men like Elias Vane occupied a particular place in his imagination, not quite real, not quite myth, somewhere in between. The stories you heard about men like that were always told by people who hadn't actually been there. This was the first time Cody had been there, more or less, and what he'd come away with was something he hadn't expected. The man wasn't what the stories made him sound like. He was quieter than that, more careful. There was nothing in him that wanted the attention. You could feel it, the way you could sometimes feel that a person genuinely didn't enjoy what they were good at. Inside the stall at the far end of the livery, Raven shifted and blew softly through her nose. Cody had given her the good grain as instructed. She'd eaten it without drama, the way horses did when they were content. He heard the livery door open and turned. Elias came in out of the dark, carrying his saddlebag over one shoulder, moving with the slight careful quality of a man whose body was reporting its complaints after a long day. Taken a room above the general store, Cody knew, because Mrs. Partridge, who ran the store, had told practically everyone within earshot the way she reported everything, which was to say immediately, and with embellishment. Elias saw Cody on the bucket and stopped. He looked at him for a moment without saying anything. "She eat?" he asked, meaning Raven. "Yes, sir, good grain, like you said." Elias nodded and moved to the stall, checking her over in the methodical way he had, running his hand along her shoulder, checking her feet, looking at her eyes. Raven tolerated this with the patience of an animal that had been checked over 10,000 times and had simply come to accept it as the price of his company. "You were watching," Elias said. Not accusing, just stating. Cody's face went warm. "The window was right there." "I know where the window is." Elias straightened. In the weak light of the livery lamp, he looked tired in a way that was different from physical tired somewhere deeper, in the way that accumulated over years rather than hours. "What did you see?" Cody thought about that. "I saw Donnie come out looking like somebody told him something he didn't want to hear." Something shifted in Elias's expression, not quite a smile. That's about right. I thought there'd be shooting. So did they. Why wasn't there? Elias was quiet for a moment, his hand still resting on Raven's neck. The horse leaned into him slightly, an unconscious pressure, the kind of thing animals did when they trusted something without being able to explain why. Because I gave them a choice, Elias said finally. Most men, when they feel like they have to prove something, they'll push until they get hurt, or until someone gives them permission to stop. Caleb Voss was smart enough to take the permission. And Donnie? Donnie's 26 years old and doesn't know yet that being fast isn't the same as being right. He paused. He might figure it out. He might not. That's his problem to live with. Cody thought about this. What about the other one? The one you hit? Cole, Elias considered. He was doing a job, nothing personal in it. Men like Cole, you don't take it personal either. He was going to shoot you. He was going to try. Elias picked up his saddlebag and moved toward the livery door. He stopped there, the dark of the street behind him, and looked back at Cody with the expression of a man trying to decide whether a piece of information is worth passing on. Go home, he said. Your mother's worried. Then he was gone, and Cody sat alone in the livery with the smell of hay and horse and the sound of Raven breathing, and he thought about permission and choice, and what it meant to be fast versus what it meant to be right, and he stayed there for another 20 minutes before he went home. The night passed without incident. That was the thing about near disasters, they left a residue in the air, a particular alertness that took hours to settle. The Lucky Spur's barman, whose name was Arthur Reese, and who had been tending bar in Blackstone Ridge for 9 years, swept up the broken glass and righted the chair that Donnie had knocked back and poured himself a drink that he didn't usually allow himself on working nights. He stood behind the bar in the empty saloon and thought about what he'd witnessed that afternoon, and he found that the more he turned it over, the less certain he was about how to feel about it. He'd expected a bloodbath. Anyone who'd seen Caleb Voss in operation before, and Arthur Reese had, 3 years back in a town called Meridian, a situation that had ended with 2 men dead, and a third crippled, would have expected the same. Voss was not a man who left room for alternative outcomes. He closed situations, that was the phrase people used. He closed situations in the way that a door closes final, leaving nothing open on the other side. And yet the drifter with the scarred jaw and the quiet eyes had found a way to leave the door open. Arthur Reese poured a second drink and decided not to think about it too hard. Whatever was happening with Elias Vane, it wasn't finished. He had the same feeling he'd had in Meridian 3 years ago, that this was a beginning and not an end. That the particular shape of trouble that had walked into his saloon that afternoon was not the kind that resolved itself quietly in one afternoon. He wasn't wrong. 3 days passed. Elias spent them in Blackstone Ridge in a state of deliberate stillness that was not quite peace. He ate at the small restaurant off the main street, a place that served 3 things, and served all 3 of them adequately. And he took his meals in the corner with his back to the wall, which was not paranoia but habit, the distinction being that paranoia anticipated threats that weren't there, while habit simply remained prepared for ones that might be. He tended to Raven in the mornings. He walked the town's perimeter twice, not conspicuously, but with the casual thoroughness of a man who likes to know his surroundings. He was waiting for something. He wasn't sure what, exactly: a letter, a messenger, another set of hired guns riding in from the south. Voss had said he'd tell Hale what happened, and Elias believed him, but belief and certainty were different countries with no bridge between them. On the second day, a woman named Ruth Finley spoke to him. She ran a dry goods store with her husband, who was currently in bed with a lung complaint that had been going on long enough that the word complaint had started to feel insufficient. She was maybe 55, built solidly, with a kind of face that had once been pretty and had become something better than pretty, through years of use expressive, alive, interesting in a way that prettiness rarely was. She had watched the events of 2 days prior from her window, and she was one of the people who had not retreated to the back of her house while it happened. She came up to him as he was leaving the restaurant and said, "Without preamble, I want to know if you're planning to stay." Elias looked at her. "Why?" "Because this town has had enough trouble in the last 2 years. And if you're the kind of trouble that keeps arriving rather than the kind that comes once and leaves, I'd like to know." There was nothing hostile in it. It was an honest question from a practical woman, and he found he had no immediate desire to be difficult about it. "I don't know yet," he said. She studied him. "That's an honest answer." "I try." She looked at him for another moment, reassessing something. "My husband needs supplies hauled from the depot in Cutter's Ford. Normally he does it, but he can't travel right now." She said this without self-pity, just as fact, the way competent people stated facts that needed addressing. "I need someone who can handle a wagon and not get robbed. I'm not asking because of what happened at the saloon. I'm asking because you're here, and you look like someone who can handle a wagon." Elias hadn't hauled freight since he was 22 years old. He also hadn't had a reason to go to Cutter's Ford in 18 months, and Cutter's Ford was exactly the kind of place a man in his situation ought to have a reason to visit. The same town where Daniel Hale had died. The same town where the witnesses to that shooting still lived. "What's the pay?" he asked. Ruth Finley named a figure that was fair. Not generous, not cheap, fair. "All right," Elias said. She seemed to have expected more argument. She gave him a look that suggested she was recalibrating her understanding of him, then nodded and said she needed the wagon gone by morning. He said morning was fine. The road to Cutter's Ford ran southeast through land that got drier and flatter the further you went, the scrub giving way eventually to stretches of pale caliche and rock that reflected the heat back up at you from below, as well as beating down from above. It was a 4-hour drive, longer with a loaded return wagon. Elias had taken worse roads in worse weather and thought nothing of it. What he did think about, as Raven walked beside the wagon horse in the early quiet of the morning, was Victor Hale. He was assembling what he knew, which wasn't much. Hale owned land in 3 counties, which meant political weight in all 3, and probably beyond. He'd sent Caleb Voss, which meant he had access to professional hired men and wasn't shy about using them. He'd ordered the bounty at $3,500, substantial, enough to attract serious attention from men who knew what they were doing, but not so extravagant as to suggest that Hale had lost his practical sense to pure emotion. That last point was interesting. Pure grief, pure rage, those things drove men to extremes. They made decisions that didn't survive contact with daylight. But a bounty set at exactly the number that would draw the right kind of professional without attracting a circus of amateurs that suggested a man who was still thinking, still calculating, even inside his anger. A thinking man was harder to reason with than an emotional one in some ways. An emotional man could be brought back to reason if you found the right angle, the right moment. A thinking man had already accounted for the angles. The wagon horse was a dull bay gelding named, according to Ruth Finley, Bucket. Bucket held exactly 1 speed and no ambitions, which made him a practical choice for freight work, even if he was supremely uninteresting as a companion. 2 hours out, Elias pulled up. There was a man on the road ahead. Standing, not mounted, his horse was standing off to the right, reins hanging, grazing at something that probably didn't deserve the attention. The man himself was in the middle of the road, with the slightly uncertain posture of someone who had stopped there on purpose and was now second-guessing it. Was young, early 30s maybe. Dressed for riding, not for trouble, no visible gun, worn conspicuously, though that meant nothing. He held up one hand as Elias stopped, an open palm gesture that said he wasn't reaching for anything. "Mr. Vane," the man said. Elias waited. "My name's Edgar Pruitt. I work for Victor Hale." He stopped there, which was either restraint or nerves. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed this and was now running into the difference between the rehearsal and the actual event. "You're a long way from his land," Elias said. "He sent me. Not the way he sent Voss. I'm not a hired gun." Pruitt, search for the right word. "I handle his correspondence, his legal matters. I arrange things." "What are you arranging today?" Pruitt reached carefully into his jacket slowly, showing his hand the whole way, and produced an envelope, which he held up. "He wants to meet with you, face to face, without men like Voss involved. He asked me to deliver this personally and wait for your response." Elias looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he set the brake on the wagon and climbed down. He took the envelope from Pruitt, broke the seal, and read the letter inside. It was short. Hale's handwriting was careful and even, the handwriting of a man who had been taught to write by someone who considered it important. This letter said that he understood the events in Blackstone Ridge had not gone according to his expectations, that he believed there were things about the death of his brother that had not been fully explained to him, that he was requesting, the word request was underlined slightly, which Elias found interesting, a meeting at Hale's estate in 7 days, on neutral enough terms that Elias could attend without believing he was walking into a trap. The final line said, "I am not finished grieving and I will not pretend otherwise, but I am willing to hear what actually happened before I decide what comes next." Elias read it twice, then he folded it and put it in his coat. "You write this himself?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Pruitt said. He wrote 3 drafts. 3. He crossed out a good deal. Pruitt had relaxed slightly, the way men did when they realized the encounter wasn't going to turn violent immediately. He's Mr. Hale is not a man who finds it easy to ask for things. That letter was difficult for him. Elias looked at Pruitt for a moment, reading him the way he read most people, not for what they were saying but for what they were doing while they said it. Pruitt was telling the truth. He was uncomfortable, he was slightly afraid, and he was also, underneath both of those things, something that looked like genuine loyalty to the man he worked for. Not the loyalty of a hired hand, but the loyalty of someone who had decided over time that a person was worth being loyal to. That didn't mean Hale deserved it. But it meant something. Tell him I'll come, Elias said. Pruitt blinked. He'd been ready for more negotiation. Just that's your answer, you'll come? 7 days. At his estate, Elias climbed back up to the wagon seat. Tell him I'll come alone, and I'd appreciate if he did the same. Not the same room, I'm not a fool, but without 20 armed men waiting in the barn. I'll tell him. And Pruitt Elias picked up the reins. Tell him to read whatever he has about what happened that night in Cutter's Ford before I arrive. The actual accounts, not the version his grief gave him. Pruitt stood in the road, processing this. Is there something in the accounts that he should know? There's something in the accounts that might change what he thinks he knows, Elias said. That's all I'll say before I've spoken with him directly. He gave Bucket the signal to walk, and the wagon moved off down the road, Raven falling into step beside it, and Pruitt stood in the dust and watched them go. Cutter's Ford hadn't changed much in 18 months. Towns like this had a particular resistance to change, not from any civic philosophy, but simply from the fact that they existed in places where the cost of building anything new was high and the rewards were uncertain, so things tended to stay as they were until they fell down. The depot was at the north end, a low building with a loading dock that needed new boards and probably always would. Elias hauled in Ruth Finley's supplies without incident, signed the papers the depot man required, and spent 20 minutes loading the wagon with the careful method of a man who'd done it before and knew the difference between a load that would hold and one that wouldn't. Then, because he was here and had time, he went looking for the people he'd thought about on the drive down. There had been 6 witnesses in the saloon in Cutter's Ford the night Daniel Hale died. He'd thought about all 6 of them at various points over the last 18 months, because they were the only people in the world who carried in their heads a clear picture of what had actually occurred. Not Elias's version, not Victor Hale's version, but the thing itself. He found 2 of them. The first was a man named Garland Webb, who worked at the hardware store and who had been in the saloon that night because his wife had thrown him out of the house for 2 hours to give herself peace, a domestic arrangement that had apparently become regular. Webb was startled to see Elias and spent the first 30 seconds of their conversation looking at the door, the way a man looked at a door when he was calculating whether he could reach it. I don't want any trouble, Webb said. I know, Elias said. I'm not bringing any. I want to know what you told the marshal. Webb's expression changed, relieved slightly. He'd given a statement to the marshal 3 days after the shooting, and he'd told the truth in it, which had cost him 2 uncomfortable weeks, during which certain men connected to the Hale operation had expressed their displeasure in ways that stopped just short of actionable. I told him what I saw, Webb said. Daniel came across the floor at you. Gun was already out. You didn't start it. You told that to Hale's men when they came asking? Webb's jaw tightened. I told them what I told the marshal. They didn't like it. He picked up a piece of hardware from a nearby display and turned it in his hands, not looking at it. Something to do with his hands. Victor Hale came through himself. Did you know that? About a month after. Came through and talked to everyone who'd been in that room. Elias hadn't known. What did he say? Didn't say much. Listened mostly. You could tell he was hoping to hear something different. That maybe you'd started it, or there was something before, some argument nobody'd mentioned. Webb set the hardware piece down. There wasn't. What happened is what I said happened. Daniel Hale got drunk and decided he was going to kill you for reasons I don't fully understand, and you put him down before he could. Did Hale believe you? Webb looked at him. He believed me, I think. But believing something and accepting it are 2 different things, aren't they? Elias left the hardware store and found the second witness, a woman named Clara Doyle, who served meals at a boarding house and had been at the saloon that night visiting a friend. She was more direct than Webb she'd been direct at the time, and had apparently stayed that way through the unpleasantness that followed. She had told Hale's people and Hale himself exactly what she'd seen without apology, and she told Elias now that she'd do it again if she had to. He was a drunk, and he had a temper, and he was looking for someone to take it out on. Clara said of Daniel Hale, not unkindly but without softening it, that night it was you. It could have been someone else. It was going to be someone, sooner or later. You ever say that to Victor Hale? I did, actually. She refilled her coffee cup from a pot on the stove. He sat right here in this kitchen. I said it to his face. He didn't like it. But he didn't call me a liar either. She looked at Elias across the kitchen table. He's a complicated man, Victor Hale. He's not stupid and he's not pure evil, which makes him harder to hate than the simple version. She paused. Are you planning to go see him? I'm planning to go see him. Clara nodded slowly. Then take some advice from someone who's had a conversation with him and come out the other side. Don't argue with his grief. You can't win that. Talk to him about Daniel, what he was actually like, the version you saw, not the version Hale keeps in his head. Give him something real to hold on to instead of the story he's been telling himself. Elias considered this. You think that would matter to him? I think he's been surrounded by men who tell him what he wants to hear for so long that someone telling him something true is more disorienting than anything else you could do to him. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. And disoriented men sometimes do better thinking than certain men do. In my experience, he drove back to Blackstone Ridge in the late afternoon with the wagon loaded and Ruth Finley's supplies accounted for, and the road straight ahead of him going gold in the declining sun. Raven walked beside Bucket with her usual indifference to the wagon horses company, and the land opened up flat in every direction. And Elias sat with the reins loose in his hands and thought about disoriented men and the stories they told themselves. He had a story too. He knew that. The story he told about Daniel Hale's death was true. It was true in the way that most true stories were true, which was to say it was accurate but not complete. The accurate part was that Daniel had come at him with a gun already drawn, and Elias had responded in the way that 11 years of this life had made unavoidable. The incomplete part was what Elias hadn't examined very carefully afterward, why Daniel Hale, drunk and angry in a Cuttersford saloon, had chosen him, had crossed the floor specifically toward Elias Vane. Clara Doyle had said it could have been anyone. She might be right, but Clara Doyle hadn't been the one Daniel Hale's eyes had fixed on from across the room. There was something in the way the man had looked at him, not the unfocused aggression of a drunk looking for a target, but something more specific, more aimed that Elias had buried under the immediate necessity of surviving the next 30 seconds, and hadn't dug back up since. He thought about it now, in the flat afternoon light with Cutter's Ford behind him and Blackstone Ridge ahead. Daniel Hale had said something before he drew. Elias had pushed the words down in his memory, filed them under irrelevant in the emergency of the moment. He pulled them back now. You think I don't know what you are. That was what Daniel had said. Not you killed someone I know, or you cheated someone I know, the kind of specific accusation you might expect from a man with a specific grievance. Instead, something more ambiguous, more personal. You think I don't know what you are. What did that mean? The wagon wheel found a rut and jolted, and Elias tightened his grip on the reins and brought Bucket back to center, and the question moved to the back of his mind without answering itself. Ruth Finley was waiting at the store when he pulled up just before sundown. She checked the load with the competence of someone who'd been checking loads for many years and found everything in order, which she acknowledged without excessive gratitude, just the nod of a woman confirming that something had been done correctly. There's food inside, she said. If you haven't eaten. He had not eaten. He followed her through the store into the back room, which served as both storage and, apparently, the informal dining area for a family that didn't stand on ceremony. Her husband was not visible, still in bed, presumably, which the evening quiet of the back room seemed to confirm. She had made something simple: beans and cornbread, the kind of meal that had fed half the frontier and wasn't trying to be more than it was. He sat at the small table and ate while she stood at the counter doing accounts, and they were quiet together in a way that didn't require filling. After a while she said, without looking up from the accounts, "My husband knows who you are." Elias set down his spoon. "Not from the saloon business," she said. "He knew your name before you came through. He didn't say anything when you first arrived because he wasn't sure." She paused. "He knows a man named Dawson Pruitt. Dawson was with you in Sweetwater," Elias said. "Yes." She looked at him now. "He says Pruitt has a lot to say about you. Most of it, he says, is true. Some of it he thinks Pruitt stretched for the sake of a good story." "The parts about Sweetwater are true," Elias said. "Pruitt doesn't need to stretch those. Sweetwater was 7 years ago. There had been a water rights dispute that had turned violent, the kind that starts as a legal argument and ends with men dead in a ditch because someone decided the law was moving too slowly. Elias had been hired as a mediator initially, which was a word that had ultimately proven inadequate to what the situation required. He'd come out the other side with a different name than he'd gone in with, and Dawson Pruitt had been on the same side of the situation and had apparently been talking about it ever since. "My husband said you saved his brother's ranch," Ruth said. "It needed saving," Elias said, which was true and was also the kind of answer that allowed him not to say more. She looked at him for a moment. "He also said you broke 3 of a man's fingers when that man tried to bribe you to switch sides." 4 fingers, Elias said. He's rounding down. Something shifted in Ruth Finley's face, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, an involuntary movement of the muscles around her eyes. She looked back at her accounts. "There's something you should know," she said, and her voice had changed, the conversational quality gone out of it, replaced by something careful. The man who was sitting outside the barber shop while the business in the saloon was happening, the one pretending to sleep. Elias went still. He'd seen the man. He'd marked him as one of Voss's people and discounted him after Voss left, which he now recognized as a gap in his thinking. "He didn't leave with the others," Ruth said. "I saw him in town the next morning." And the morning after, she set down her pen. "I saw him talking to the postal clerk 2 days ago." I don't know what they said, but the clerk looked unhappy after. You know his name? No, he's not from here. He eats at the restaurant once a day, and he stays in a room at the boarding house. He has a horse with a 8H brand on the left shoulder. H. Victor Hale's brand. Elias hadn't known it, but Ruth apparently did, which said something about how far Hale's reach extended and how much local knowledge Ruth Finley had accumulated in her years behind that counter. He's watching, Elias said. Not a question, he's watching, she confirmed. And he's been watching for 6 days, which is 3 days before you even arrived. Which means someone knew you were coming to Blackstone Ridge before you did. He turned that over all night. The room above the general store was small, and the bed was adequate, and he lay on it without sleeping, working through the geometry of it. Someone had known his route, or predicted it, which amounted to the same thing. He had not told anyone he was heading to Blackstone Ridge. He rarely announced where he was going, because the habit of privacy had long since become indistinguishable from basic survival. But he had been moving in a certain pattern in the Southern Territories for months, and a man who studied that pattern carefully might have anticipated where the pattern would lead next. A man like Victor Hale, who had resources and patience, could have positioned a watcher 6 days in advance without difficulty. The question was what that watcher was waiting for. It wasn't for Elias to arrive, he'd already arrived, and the watcher was still there. It wasn't to signal Voss, because Voss had already left. The watcher was counting something, tracking someone, building a picture. Elias sat up in the dark. He was thinking about what Edgar Pruitt had said on the road, that Hale had written 3 drafts of the letter, crossed out a good deal. And he was thinking about what Clara Doyle had said about disoriented men doing better thinking. And he was thinking about what Daniel Hale had said in the moments before his death. You think I don't know what you are. These things were connected. He could feel the connection without being able to see the shape of it. Yet, the way you could feel the presence of a structure in the dark by running your hands along the walls. Victor Hale wanted a meeting. He'd sent Pruitt personally, taken care with the letter, specified no hired guns. He'd already spoken with every witness to his brother's death. He had a man watching Blackstone Ridge from before Elias arrived. This was not the behavior of a man consumed entirely by grief and rage. This was the behavior of a man trying to understand something. He found the watcher the next morning. It wasn't difficult. Ruth had described him well enough that he had a face in mind, and a man who stays in a town for 6 days, while trying to appear unremarkable, becomes, through the paradox of that effort, more remarkable than he'd be if he'd simply acted normal. The watcher was eating breakfast at the restaurant with the careful propriety of someone who was acutely aware of being observed, which told Elias that whoever Hale employed for surveillance was better with horses and reporting than with the subtler arts of being invisible. He sat down across from the man. The watcher looked up from his food. He was maybe 35, with a lean, angular face and eyes that had the alertness of someone used to paying attention to things. He looked at Elias and said nothing, which was actually the right response under the circumstances. I know who you work for, Elias said. I know why you're here. I'm not going to make trouble about it. The watcher waited. I'm going to Hale's estate in 5 days. You can write that down and send it. Elias leaned forward slightly. But I want you to tell him something beyond that. Tell him I spoke to Garland Webb. Tell him I spoke to Clara Doyle. Tell him I'm coming to give him the version of that night that the witnesses gave, not my version, theirs. What they saw, what they said, what they told him when he came through Cutter's Ford himself. He paused. Can you do that? The watcher said yes. His name first, Elias said. Nathan, the watcher said after a moment. Nathan Creel. Nathan. Elias sat back. Eat your breakfast. Then go send your message. Nathan Creel looked at him across the table with the expression of a man who had come prepared for a certain kind of encounter and had received an entirely different kind and wasn't yet sure what to do with the difference. You're not afraid of him, Nathan said. It came out as more of a statement than he'd probably intended. I respect him, Elias said. That's different. Most men who've had Voss sent after them are afraid. Most men haven't been living the way I've been living. Elias stood. I'll see you on the road in 5 days, Mr. Creel. Try to ride at a reasonable distance. Raven doesn't like people trailing too close. He left Nathan Creel with his breakfast and went out into the morning, which was cool still, the kind of cool that would be gone by midday and wouldn't be missed until it was back. He had 5 days before the most important conversation of the last 2 years of his life. 5 days to think about what Daniel Hale had meant, what Victor Hale was looking for, and whether the thing that connected all of it was something Elias was prepared to name out loud. He didn't know yet, but he was starting to think he would need to be, whether he was prepared or not. Raven was waiting in the livery. He went to her, and she pressed her nose against his shoulder the way she sometimes did in the mornings, an unremarkable gesture that he had come to depend on more than he would ever have said to anyone. Stood there with his hand on her neck and let the morning settle around him, and he breathed, and he thought, and outside to the town of Blackstone Ridge, went about its ordinary business in the ordinary light of an ordinary day, entirely unaware of what was 5 days away and coming. The 5 days passed in the way that days pass when you are waiting for something, not slowly exactly, but with a particular kind of weight to each hour, a density that ordinary time didn't carry. Elias spent 2 of them doing nothing more consequential than tending to Raven, eating Ruth Finley's cooking when she offered it, and walking the edges of Blackstone Ridge in the early mornings before the heat arrived. He spent the other 3 thinking, not planning, not strategizing in the way that military men organize their thinking, more like turning a stone over repeatedly in his hands, feeling all the surfaces, getting to know the shape of it before he had to decide what to do with it. The stone was Daniel Hale's last words. "You think I don't know what you are." He had talked himself out of those words several times in the months since Cutter's Ford, told himself it was the nonsense of a drunk man, the kind of thing that sounds significant in the heat of a moment and means nothing when the moment passes. Men said things when they were drunk and angry that carried the grammar of revelation without the substance. He'd seen it enough to know, but it kept coming back. On the 4th morning, Cody found him at the livery and stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who had something to say and wasn't sure whether to say it. Elias had come to recognize this expression on the boy. He had it frequently. "You're leaving tomorrow," Cody said. "That's right." "To go see Hale." Elias looked at him. "How do you know that?" Cody shrugged, which was not an answer but communicated clearly enough that the information had moved through Blackstone Ridge, the way information always moved through small towns, sideways, through gaps, without any identifiable source. "Mrs. Finley mentioned it to Harlan Dodd, and Harlan told my mother, and my mother told me not to ask about it, which obviously means she expected me to find out from somewhere else. Your mother's a smart woman, she is." Cody moved further into the livery. He had a natural ease around the animals that came from years of working with them, and he went to Raven's stall without being invited, offering the back of his hand the way Elias had taught him. Raven investigated it and found it acceptable. "Are you coming back?" Elias picked up the brush he'd been using. "That's a question I don't know the answer to." "Because of Hale?" "Because I don't usually know where I'm going until I've been somewhere." He ran the brush along Raven's shoulder. "That's not a particularly satisfying answer." "No," Cody agreed. Then, after a moment, "If you don't come back, will you do something for me before you go?" Elias waited. "Teach me the thing you did with Mason Cole. That thing where you stepped inside instead of drawing." Elias was quiet for a moment. He set the brush down on the stall rail. "How old are you, 13? And you want me to teach you how to get inside a man's draw?" "I want to know how to keep someone from shooting me," Coatsy said. "That's not the same thing." It was, in fact, not the same thing. Elias stood with that for a moment, recognizing the distinction for what it was, not a child glorifying violence, but a child trying to understand how survival worked, which was something different and worth respecting. "Step in toward the gun sight," Elias said. "Not away from it. Your instinct says go away from the weapon, but that gives him room to track you. You step in, you close the distance, and the angle changes. He can't extend his arm to fire without hitting his own body first." He paused. "It only works if you're already moving when he is. If you're a step behind, it doesn't matter." Cody absorbed this with the seriousness of someone filing it away. "And the elbow?" "That's just fighting," Elias said. "That part's not elegant." "Nothing about it looked elegant." "Good. Elegant means slow. Slow gets you hurt." Cody stood there for another moment, then pushed himself off the stall rail. "I hope you come back," he said. He said it plainly, without the performative quality that adults sometimes put into sincere statements, and walked out of the livery with his hands back in his pockets. Elias watched him go. Then he picked up the brush and finished with Raven in silence. He rode out early the next morning before Blackstone Ridge had properly woken up. Nathan Creel fell in behind him at a distance that suggested he'd taken the comment about Raven seriously. The land opened flat and pale ahead of them, the sky just beginning to shift from gray to the particular washed-out blue of early desert morning. The Hale estate was 3 hours south and east, on land that got progressively better as you approached it. More water, more grass. The careful management of someone who had been working the same ground long enough to understand it. Elias noticed this as he rode, the way the quality of the land changed, the way the cattle he started seeing were in better condition than most. Whatever else Victor Hale was, he was a good cattleman. That was worth noting because competence in one area was sometimes evidence of a thinking mind and sometimes just evidence of single-minded obsession, and knowing which applied would be useful. He was 3 miles from the estate when the riders appeared. 4 of them, coming from the southeast at an angle that would intersect his path. They weren't riding aggressively, no galloping, no shouting, just 4 men moving to intercept, which was its own kind of message. Elias slowed Raven to a walk and waited for them to close the distance. The lead writer was a man he didn't recognize. Broad, dark-bearded, with the posture of someone used to giving orders from horseback. He pulled up 10 yards away and looked at Elias with a particular assessment of a man who has been told something about someone and is now comparing the description to the reality. Elias Vane, the man said. You're not Hale, Elias said. No, I'm Thomas Garrett. I run operations here. He said it with the directness of someone who understood that his title meant something. Mr. Hale asked me to ride out and meet you, escort you in. He sent 4 men to escort me in? Garrett's mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite acknowledgement. He sent 4 men to let you know the situation before you arrived at the house. So you don't arrive with surprises. What situation? Garrett glanced back at the men behind him, then back to Elias. 2 nights ago, someone tried to break into Mr. Hale's study. Made it past the outer fence before the dogs found them. They ran, nobody caught them. But there were papers disturbed in the study. Hale doesn't know what was taken, if anything, because he doesn't know what was there to begin with. He paused. He thought you should know that before you arrived. So you understood why there are more men on the property than you might have expected. Sly sat with this. He looked at Garrett for a moment, reading him the way he'd read Pruitt for the underneath, for what the words were floating on. You think I sent someone, Elias said. Mr. Hale doesn't think that. I'm telling you what happened so you don't walk into a tense house without knowing why it's tense. And what do you think, Mr. Garrett? Garrett was quiet for a moment. He had the deliberate quality of a man who chose his words after considering them rather than before. I think if you'd sent someone to break into his study 2 nights before a meeting you'd agreed to, you'd be a fool. And I don't think you're a fool. That's a considered position, Elias said. I'm a considered man. Garrett turned his horse. Come on. He's waiting. The estate's main house was larger than Elias had imagined, though not in a way that was trying to impress. It had the functional size of a working operation that needed space for accounts and meetings and the administration of something large, not the decorative size of a man who wanted his house to say something about him. This distinction mattered, and Elias filed it. There were men visible on the property 6 that he counted openly, probably more he wasn't meant to count. Not positioned aggressively, just present, the way men were present on a property that had recently had an intruder. He understood it. He didn't like it exactly, but he understood it. Garrett took him around to the side entrance rather than the front, which was either a slight or a practical choice depending on how you read it. Elias decided to read it as practical. They tied the horses and Garrett led him through a hallway that smelled of wood smoke and leather, and the particular old paper smell of a working office, into a room at the back of the house. Victor Hale was standing at the window. He turned when Elias came in, and Elias had a moment to form a first impression that he knew would be difficult to revise later. Hale was 60, maybe 62, with white hair and a face that had been handsome once, and was now something more complex than handsome, marked by weather and loss, and the particular carving that time does to faces that have felt things deeply. He was not as tall as Elias had pictured. He was not as physically imposing. What he was, standing there in the daylight from the window, was tired. Not the tired of a man who hadn't slept. The tired of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had begun to understand that he would be carrying it for the rest of his life, and was still working out how to do that without it crushing him. Mr. Vane, Hale said. Mr. Hale. Garrett closed the door from the outside. They were alone. Hale moved to a chair and sat, gesturing toward the one across from it. Elias sat, not because he was entirely comfortable sitting in a room with one exit, and a man who had reason to want him dead, but because remaining standing when invited to sit was a kind of declaration, and he hadn't come here to make declarations. You spoke to Webb and Clara Doyle, Hale said. I did, Nathan told me. Hale folded his hands in his lap. They were working hands scarred across the knuckles, thickened at the joints. He also told me that you sat down with him at breakfast and told him what to report to me. That surprised me. I didn't see the point of pretending I hadn't noticed him, Elias said. Most men in your situation would have. Most men in my situation spend a lot of energy maintaining the appearance of control. I find that exhausting. Hale looked at him steadily. He had gray eyes that were sharp in the way that eyes sometimes stayed sharp in old men, even when the rest of them was fading. I want to talk about Daniel, he said. Straight to it, no approach. Whatever Elias had expected, it was at least partially this a man too old and too tired to spend time circling. All right, Elias said. Not the shooting. I know the shooting. I went to Cutter's Ford myself. I sat in that saloon and I asked everyone who'd been there, and they all told me the same thing. And I know what happened in the last 60 seconds. He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. A small movement. I want to know what happened before. What Daniel said. What he was like in those minutes before it ended. Elias looked at him. This was not what he'd prepared for, and the part of him that was always calculating shifted uncomfortably. He was drunk, Elias said. Significantly drunk. The kind of drunk where the first layer of a person is gone and you're seeing whatever's underneath it. What was underneath it? Elias thought about this. He thought about Daniel Hale, as he'd actually been in that saloon, not the threat, not the target, but the person. 38 years old, going by what he'd been told, brown hair lighter than Victor's, a face that still had some of the unformed quality of a man who'd spent his life in the shadow of a capable older brother, without quite finding his own shape. He was unhappy, Elias said. Genuinely unhappy. Not angry in the way of a man with a specific grievance, angry the way people are when they've been unhappy for a long time and they can't find anywhere to put it. He paused. He said something to me before he drew. I've been thinking about it since. Hale said nothing. The quality of his attention changed, sharpened, went very still. He said, "You think I don't know what you are?" Elias watched Hale's face when he said it. What moved across Hale's face was not grief and not anger. It was something that looked closer to recognition, and it moved quickly, as if he'd caught himself and pulled it back. "Did you know what he meant by that?" Elias asked. A long silence. Long enough that Elias began to think Hale wasn't going to answer. "Daniel," Hale said finally, "spent the last 3 years of his life trying to find something he could do better than me." He said it with the flatness of a man who has examined this truth from many angles and has stopped being surprised by it. He didn't have my head for business. He knew that. Our father knew it. Everyone knew it except Daniel for a long time. And then when he figured it out, it broke something in him. He shifted in the chair. He started looking into things. Old things. Things about men in the territories who I'd had dealings with over the years. He thought if he could find something, some piece of information that I didn't have, it would matter. That it would change the balance. "What kind of information?" Hale looked at him. "About you," he said, "specifically about you." The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silences that had preceded it. Elias waited with the particular stillness he'd developed, for moments when movement in any direction was premature. "He'd been looking into you for 6 months before Cutter's Ford," Hale said. "I didn't know that until after. I found his papers after he died." He reached into the desk beside his chair and produced a small bundle of folded papers, which he held but didn't yet offer. "He'd been talking to people about you. Men who'd known you before the territories. Men from further east."
"What men?"
"Men from a town called Harlan County, Kentucky." Hale held his gaze. "Does that mean something to you?" It did. It meant a great deal to Elias, and the fact that it did was something he had spent 11 years ensuring that almost nobody knew. "What did he find?" Elias asked. His voice was level. He had trained it to be level, and it was. Hale put the papers on the table between them. He didn't push them toward Elias. He laid them there as if placing something down carefully rather than presenting it. "He found a man named Elias Vane," Hale said. "Your father. A man with a particular kind of history in Harlan County that involved a business arrangement with a United States Marshal named Corbett and a series of land transactions that weren't entirely above board." He paused. "He found that Elias Vane died in a federal jail in 1864 while facing charges that were never fully prosecuted because the primary witness against him recanted. And he believed, based on his notes, that the witness who recanted was you." Elias said nothing. "You were 20, Hale said. If the dates in his notes are right. You were 20 years old and you made a decision that most men couldn't have made, regardless of age. And then you disappeared from Harlan County and eventually became a man named Elias Vane, which is also your name, just without the rest of it." The afternoon light in the room had shifted while they'd been talking, moving off the window and going lower, casting longer shadows. Elias sat in the changed light and understood, fully and without the self-deception that had served him adequately for 11 years, that he was going to have to say something true. "Elias Vane was my father," he said. "He was also a man who used legal systems like tools and didn't particularly care who got injured in the process. The land transactions involved 3 families who lost property they'd held for 20 years. One of those families had 7 children. He looked at the papers on the table but didn't touch them." I testified. "I told the truth about what I'd seen, because the alternative was watching those families get nothing while a federal marshal and my father divided up what they'd taken." He stopped. "He died in custody of a fever, not of the charges. His notes suggest you felt responsible," Hale said carefully. "His notes were right," Elias said. "I've been carrying that a long time." He finally picked up the papers, not to read them, just to hold them, to acknowledge that they existed. "Is this what Daniel was going to use? Against me or against whatever your relationship was with me?" "I think," Hale said slowly, "that Daniel wanted to tell me something I didn't know. That he'd found something about the famous Elias Vane that contradicted the reputation. That you were a man with a complicated past rather than a simple legend." He exhaled. "I don't think he fully worked out what he was going to do with it." I think he was drunk in that saloon in Cutter's Ford, and he saw you, and the information he'd been carrying for 6 months came out badly. You think I don't know what you are. There it was. The thing he'd been turning over for 18 months, finally with its shape visible. Daniel Hale had known about Harlan County, had known about Aldous, had found the one piece of Elias Vane that Elias Vane had worked hardest to bury, and had carried it into a saloon drunk enough to say it and not drunk enough to hold it together when Elias didn't respond the way he'd expected. What had he expected? A reaction? Some crack in the composure? Some admission of a shame that would shift the power in the room? He hadn't expected nothing, and the nothing had broken something in him, and the breaking had gone badly. I didn't know any of this that night, Elias said, if I had. He wasn't sure how to finish the sentence honestly. If you had, what? Hale asked. I don't know. I'd like to think I would have tried harder to understand what he was actually asking. But I was in a situation that was going to kill me in about 10 seconds, and I did what I had to do to survive. I can be sorry about that without being sorry for surviving. Hale was quiet for a moment, the particular stillness of a man processing something that was rearranging his interior landscape. I sent Voss after you because I believed you'd provoked it, Hale said. That was what my grief told me. My grief is very loud. He said this without self-pity, just as fact. It's been loud for 18 months. It makes it difficult to hear anything else. I know what that's like, Elias said. Hale looked at him. Do you? Elias put the papers back on the table. I know what it's like to have something you did or didn't do follow you, to have it be the loudest thing in the room even when nothing else is making noise. He paused. My father's name follows me. What happened in Harlan County follows me. I made a decision when I was 20 years old, and it cost him his life, and I have not been able to put it down, and I probably never will. This was not the kind of thing Elias Vane said to people. It was not the kind of thing he said to anyone, because saying it required trusting the listener with something that could be used in several directions, and trusting listeners was not a skill he'd had much opportunity to develop. He said it now because the alternative was pretending, and he had been pretending for 11 years, and the pretending was wearing through, and sitting in front of a man whose grief he understood better than the man knew was not the right moment to pretend anymore. Hale said nothing for a long time. He sat in the changed afternoon light with his hands in his lap and looked at nothing in particular, and Elias let him. Finally Hale said, What do you want from me, Mr. Vane? Nothing that isn't yours to give, Elias said. I want the bounty ended. I want Caleb Voss stood down. I want to be able to ride through the southern territories without wondering which hired gun it's going to be this time. He picked his next words with care. I'm not telling you to let go of your grief. I'm not telling you that what happened was fine, because it wasn't fine. Your brother is dead, and that's a true and irreparable thing. I'm telling you that sending men after me doesn't change it, and it doesn't end it. And every man you send creates an uncensored situation that might end with another person dead and another family carrying what your family's carrying. Hale closed his eyes. It was a brief motion, almost involuntary, like pressing a hand against a wound. My brother was not a good man, he said. The words came out with difficulty, each one a small effort. That doesn't mean I didn't love him. Both of those things are true at the same time, and they've been tearing at me since the day he died. The grief and the knowing that I'd spent years cleaning up after him, that some of what he'd done was because I'd put him in situations he couldn't handle, given him responsibilities he resented because they were mine and not his. He opened his eyes. He went looking for something to hold over you, because he needed something to hold over someone. And that's my fault as much as his. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere on the property, a horse called out and another answered, and the ordinary sounds of a working ranch filtered through the walls, indifferent to what was being said inside. Elias waited. I'll stand Voss down, Hale said. The bounty is done. He said it without theater, without ceremony. Just said it, the way a man said something once he'd decided it. I want those papers back. Daniel's papers. They're not anyone else's business. Agreed, Elias said. He pushed the papers across the table, and Hale took them and put them back in the desk drawer and closed it. They sat for another moment in the kind of silence that falls between two people who have said real things to each other and are adjusting to the change in the air between them. You should stay the night, Hale said. The road back is long, and your horse has already traveled it once today. Elias considered this. Every practical instinct he had said to ride out, to put distance between himself and this place, to not put himself in debt to a man's hospitality when the situation was still finding its shape. But underneath the practical instincts was something else, the recognition that accepting the offer would cost Hale something. A gesture of trust from a man for whom trust was not cheap, and that refusing it would cost them both something harder to name. All right, he said. Hale stood, and Elias stood, and Hale extended his hand. Elias shook it. The grip was firm and brief, the handshake of men who have not entirely resolved things but have agreed to stop adding to the damage. Garrett will show you where, Hale said. Elias nodded. He moved to the door and then stopped. One more thing, he said without turning fully. The break-in 2 nights ago. His study. What about it? It wasn't random. He did turn then, enough to see Hale's face. Someone knew what was in those papers. Someone knew what Daniel had found, which means Daniel told someone before he went to Cutter's Ford. He let that sit for a moment. You might want to think about who that was. Because whoever it is knows things about me that you've now agreed to keep quiet, and they may not feel the same way about that agreement. Hale looked at him steadily, absorbing this. I'll think about it, he said. Elias went out into the hallway where Garrett was waiting and let the man lead him through the house toward the guest quarters, and he walked through Victor Hale's home with the odd, unfamiliar sensation of a man who has put something down that he's been carrying so long he's forgotten the weight of it. It wasn't relief. It was something more complicated than relief and more honest. It was the feeling of having told the truth about a thing and survived the telling, which was rarer than most people understood, and more costly, and more necessary, and more difficult in every way than the silence it replaced. Raven was in the stable. He checked on her before he went inside for the night, standing in the doorway of the stall with his hand on her neck in the dark, the way he sometimes needed to do at the end of a day that had required more of him than he'd expected to give. She didn't ask him anything. She didn't offer anything he hadn't asked for. She just stood there in the dark, being exactly what she was, and he stood there beside her and let the night settle around them both. He didn't sleep well in Victor Hale's house. That wasn't surprising. He rarely slept well anywhere, and sleeping well in the home of a man who had spent 18 months trying to have him killed would have required a level of ease that Elias simply didn't possess. He lay on the guest bed in the dark and listened to the sounds of the estate settling around him, the distant movement of cattle, the occasional voice of a night watchman making his rounds, the wind coming off the desert and finding the gaps in the window frame. He thought about what Hale had told him. About Daniel's 6 months of investigation, the papers Harlan County, about the break-in 2 nights before his arrival, which has not been random, which meant someone had known what was in those papers and had decided the window between Elias agreeing to come and Elias actually arriving was the right moment to take them, or to read them, or to confirm they existed. That last possibility bothered him most. Someone who already knew what was in Daniel's notes and merely wanted to verify that Hale had them, that was a person who had been close to Daniel. Close enough for Daniel, in the months before Cutter's Ford, to have shared what he'd found about Elias Vane and Harlan County. He turned that over until the room began to gray with early light. Then he got up, dressed, and went to find Garrett. Garrett was already in the yard when Elias came out, talking to one of the hands about something involving a fence line that needed attention 3 miles out. He finished the conversation and looked at Elias with the flat patience of a man accustomed to mornings that started before he was ready for them. "You're leaving," Garrett said. "Shortly. I need to ask you something first." Garrett waited. "The break-in," Elias said. "The night watchman who found the intruder, did he see anything useful? Height, build, how they moved?" Garrett's expression shifted slightly. Not suspicion exactly, but a reassessment of the question. He saw someone running toward the east fence. Said they moved fast. Thin, he thought, but he was 40 yards back and it was dark. He paused. Why? Because whoever it was knew exactly which building to go to. They went straight to the study, not the main house, not the bunkhouse. They knew the layout and they knew what they were looking for. Elias watched Garrett's face. "Has anyone on this property left in the last 3 weeks? Quit, been let go, taken time away?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man. Elias had decided the kind who didn't speak before he'd sorted through the implications of speaking. "One man," he said finally. "Writer named Pell. He left about 2 weeks back. Said he had family trouble, needed to go." "Did he have family trouble?" "I didn't ask." Garrett's jaw tightened slightly. "I should have." "Did Pell know Daniel Hale?" A longer pause. "They were friendly. Daniel came out here maybe 4 or 5 times a year. Pell was here 6 years. They were friendly. The way a young man's friendly with the hands when he's trying to be someone different than the person his family expects." Elias put that together with what he already had. Daniel spending his last months digging into Elias Vane's history, telling someone what he'd found. A ranch hand named Pell who'd been close enough to Daniel to hear things, who'd left 2 weeks before Elias arrived and come back for the papers 2 nights before the meeting. Working for someone. Not for himself, a ranch hand with 6 years of wages didn't have the resources or the motive for this kind of operation. Working for someone who wanted those papers and the information in them. "Does the name mean anything to you?" Elias asked. "In connection to anyone outside this property? Anyone Daniel might have introduced him to?" Garrett shook his head slowly, then stopped. "There was a lawyer," he said. "Came out twice last year. Daniel introduced him around. Sharpman city clothes, from up north, I want to say territorial capital. He rubbed the back of his neck. His name was Aldridge. First name, I don't remember. What was his business with Daniel? I assumed it was personal. Daniel didn't explain it to me, and it wasn't my place to ask. Garrett looked at Elias steadily. I'm starting to think I should have asked. He found Hale in the dining room, alone, eating breakfast with the focused absence of a man whose mind was elsewhere, and who was eating only because Garrett, or someone like Garrett, had probably told him he needed to. He looked up when Elias came in and gestured toward the chair across from him without speaking. Elias sat and told him everything Pell, the friendship with Daniel, the lawyer named Aldridge from the territorial capital. He laid it out plainly, without speculation beyond what the facts supported, and watched Hale's face move through several expressions he was clearly not trying to conceal. I know the name Aldridge, Hale said. What do you know about him? He approached me 14 months ago about a land purchase, a strip of land on my southeast boundary that I don't actively use. He represented a group of investors who wanted to run a rail spur through it. Hale set down his fork. I declined. The offer wasn't right, and I didn't know enough about the investors behind him. Did he approach Daniel separately? Hale looked at him. The question landed visibly, a small impact. Not that I knew about. If Daniel was looking for leverage, Elias said carefully. Information about men in the territories that his brother didn't have. And if someone like Aldridge was cultivating that, feeding Daniel resources, helping him dig, then Daniel wasn't entirely working on his own. The silence that followed was the kind that Hale clearly needed to sit inside for a moment. Elias let him. You think Daniel was being used, Hale said. I think Daniel was a man who wanted to matter, and someone recognized that and pointed him in a direction that was useful to them. He paused. The information about me, about Harlan County, it's the kind of thing that could be used to discredit a man, or to control one. If someone had that information and planned to use it against me for their own reasons, they'd need it verified. Confirmed. Documented. He nodded toward the desk in the next room where the papers now sat in the drawer. Daniel did the verification work. Then he died before whoever put him up to it could collect the result. Hale was very still. And now they're trying to collect it from me. That's my thinking. Another silence. This one was different from the grief-weighted silences of yesterday, sharper, with anger moving underneath it. The anger of a man who has realized his dead brother was in the last months of his life someone else's instrument. What do you want to do about it? Hale asked. I want to know who Aldridge works for, Elias said. And I want to know why they want information about me badly enough to put Daniel Hale on it for 6 months and then send someone to break into your study. You think it's about more than just you. I think I'm a piece of something. I don't know what piece yet. Hale picked up his fork again, then set it down. The food had clearly given up on being eaten. I have a contact in the territorial capital, a judge named Farwell, who owes me something from a water dispute 3 years back. He'd know Aldridge or know someone who does. Can you reach him without making it obvious why? I've been doing business in this territory for 30 years, Hale said, with a dryness that was the closest thing to humor Elias had heard from him. I can ask a question without making it look like a question. Then ask. Elias pushed back from the table. I need to ride north before I can do anything else. There's someone I need to talk to in Blackstone Ridge. The boy at the livery. Elias looked at him. Hale almost smiled. Nathan's reports were thorough, he said. The boy doesn't know anything, Elias said. But he's been watching the town while I've been here. And if Pell came through Blackstone Ridge in the last week looking for information about me, Cody would have noticed. He notices things. Hale nodded. Then, before Elias reached the doorway, he said, My brother wasn't a bad person. He was a weak one, which is different. I've spent 18 months being angry at you when I should have been asking better questions. Elias turned. Hale was looking at the table, not at him. I don't need an apology, Elias said. I need the bounty stayed and Aldridge found. That's enough. You'll have both, Hale said. The ride back to Blackstone Ridge took 3 hours and felt longer. The land offered nothing to look at that he hadn't already seen, and his mind kept moving over the shape of what he'd put together, testing its joints, checking where it held and where it didn't. What he knew was this: someone with resources had set Daniel Hale digging into his past. That someone had then lost their instrument when Daniel died, had presumably learned about the meeting between Elias and Victor Hale, and had sent the ranch hand Pell to retrieve or read the papers before Hale could use them as a basis for peace. The fact that they'd tried to take the papers rather than simply observe suggested they were worried about what Hale might do with the Harlan County information. Worried that Hale, armed with that information, might share it with Elias, might warn him, which meant they'd plan to use the information against Elias themselves, at a time not yet arrived. The territory north of Blackstone Ridge contained something that Elias had been aware of at the edge of his thinking for months, without examining it fully: a growing dispute over a water source that served 4 counties and 17 ranches, including 2 that were the largest operating spreads in the region. a dispute that had recently entered legal proceedings, and that had recently acquired the attention of investors from the north, who were, according to the fragments of conversation Elias had picked up in the towns he'd passed through, looking to acquire distressed land in the region at favorable prices. Investors who would be helped considerably if certain men who might resist those acquisitions were discredited, or removed, or occupied with other problems. He wasn't certain. He wasn't even close to certain. But the shape of it was beginning to emerge from the fog the way shapes did when you stopped trying to force them and simply let your eyes adjust. Blackstone Ridge looked exactly as he'd left it, which was either reassuring or simply characteristic of a town that didn't change quickly. He tied Raven at the livery and found Cody there, as seemed to be reliably the case. The boy looked up with the controlled excitement of someone who had been waiting to report something and had been rehearsing how to do it casually. "Someone came through 2 days ago," Cody said without being asked. "Sat on a hay bale. Tell me." Thin man. Moved quick, the way men move when they're trying not to be watched, which is how you always know they're worth watching. Cody had clearly been saving this line. "He asked Arthur at the saloon about you. Asked where you'd gone. Arthur said he didn't know. Which is true because I didn't tell him. Did you see where the man went after?" "He stayed one night at the boarding house and left the next morning south." Cody paused. "He had a horse with a brand I didn't recognize. 2 letters overlapping like a W and something else. That wasn't the HH brand of Hale's operation, someone else's animal. Anything else?" He talked to Mrs. Alderman at the post office. Cody's expression went serious in the way it did when he understood that what he was saying mattered. She looked upset after. "She wouldn't tell me what about, but I heard her tell her husband that night that some men weren't worth arguing with." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Good work," he said, and meant it simply not as praise designed to encourage, but as honest acknowledgement of something done well. Cody absorbed this with the dignity of someone who recognized the difference. "Is it important?" "Might be," Elias said. "I need you to do something else. Stay away from the post office for a few days." "Why?" "Because if that man came through looking for information and Mrs. Alderman gave him something he wanted, he might send someone back to follow up. And I don't want you near that when it happens." Cody's expression went through several movements. The first was the instinctive protest of someone being asked to stay out of something interesting, followed almost immediately by the more considered look of someone working out that the request was being made because his safety mattered to the person making it. He nodded without argument. "Where will you be?" he asked. "Here, for a day. Then I need to ride northwest. There's a man I need to find before someone else does." The man Elias needed to find was named Silas Drummond, and finding him required knowing where to look, which Elias did. Because Drummond had a habit of spending the weeks between jobs at a small camp near a dry wash, 15 miles northwest of Blackstone Ridge. A habit that Elias knew because he'd spent 2 weeks in proximity to Drummond 7 years ago during a cattle operation that had ended badly for everyone involved and from which both of them had come out with a complicated understanding of each other. Drummond was not a friend. He was also not an enemy. He occupied the particular category that Elias had a small collection of people who understood how the territory actually worked, who moved through its uglier currents without being entirely consumed by them, and who could sometimes provide information that had no other source. Drummond was also a man who had, in the past, done work for northern investors looking to expand their land holdings in the southern territories. He found the camp in the late afternoon of the following day. Drummond was sitting outside a low tent with a fire going and a tin cup in his hand, looking at nothing in particular, which was either meditation or boredom, and with Drummond was probably both. He was 50, gray-bearded, with the permanently sun-darkened skin of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and had stopped noticing it. He looked at Elias riding up and said nothing, which was his customary greeting for most situations. Elias dismounted and tied Raven at a reasonable distance and walked to the fire and stood. "Vane," Drummond said. "Drummond." Elias crouched by the fire. "I need to ask you something." Usually when people say that they mean they need information, and they're trying to figure out how to get it without paying for it. "I'll pay for it," Elias said. "What's your rate for a name?" Drummond looked at him. "Whose name?" "The man behind a lawyer named Aldridge who operates out of the territorial capital." Something moved in Drummond's face, a slight tightening. There and gone. The involuntary response of someone who recognizes a thing they weren't expecting to be asked about. "That's a name I'd charge more for," Drummond said. "Name your price." Drummond looked at the fire for a long moment. He turned the tin cup in his hands slowly, a deliberate motion, thinking through something that appeared to have more layers than a simple pricing question. "Harlan Briggs," he said finally. Elias had heard the name. Most people in the territories had heard it at some level. Briggs was a land speculator, based in the north, with connections in the territorial legislature, and a history of acquiring large parcels of land in regions that were undergoing some form of instability. Water disputes, legal problems, economic pressure. His operation wasn't subtle once you knew what to look for. It was simply large enough that the subtlety wasn't necessary. What's his interest in the southeast counties? Elias asked. Water, Drummond said. There's a source that serves 4 counties. If you control the land around the source, you control access to the water. If you control the water, you control who can run cattle and who can't. He drank from the tin cup. 17 ranches depend on that water. Most of them would sell at a loss if they felt pressured enough. 2 of them wouldn't. Which 2? Drummond looked at him. Hale's operation is one. Elias heard what wasn't being said. What's the other? A man named Rupert Kane who runs 3,000 head about 12 miles east of Hale. Stubborn as a post and twice as useful. He's been the primary voice in the water rights legal proceedings. Without him, the legal challenge falls apart and Briggs's people can move on the source. Drummond set down the cup. Someone's been looking for a way to remove Kane from the equation. Not violently too conspicuous. Something legal, something that gives him cause to step back. And me, Elias said. Where do I come into this? Kane owes you something, Drummond said simply. 7 years ago in a town called Sweetwater. Elias went still. Kane's brother-in-law was one of the families whose land you helped defend in Sweetwater, Drummond continued. Kane knows that. He's talked about it. If Briggs's people needed Kane to step back from the water rights proceedings, discrediting the man Kane publicly calls a debt of honor would be one way to create distance. Make Kane look like he's defending someone he shouldn't. Make the whole water rights challenge look compromised by association. The shape of it was fully visible now. Elias sat with it, turning it, checking the joints. It held. It held in all the ways that mattered, and in a few ways he wished it didn't. Briggs used Daniel Hale to do the research, Elias said, through Aldridge. Daniel was looking for something to matter, and Briggs gave him a purpose and pointed him at me. That's my understanding, Drummond said. And when Daniel died, Briggs lost his documentation, and it ended up in Victor Hale's possession, which would have made Briggs very uncomfortable, Drummond said. Given that documentation of his involvement in that kind of operation, combined with the territorial capital's recent interest in his land acquisition methods, would create problems for him that go considerably beyond one water rights dispute. Elias looked at the fire. Why are you telling me this? Drummond was quiet for a moment. Because Briggs has gotten large enough that he's starting to crowd men like me, he said. I don't have a moral objection to most of what he does. It's business, same as anything else. But he doesn't leave room for anyone else to operate, and I have an investment in the current arrangement of things. He paused. And because you asked, which not many people do with the expectation of a straight answer. What does he plan to do with the information if he gets it? Elias asked. The Harlan County material. Release it strategically. At the right moment in the water rights proceedings, when Kane's connection to you is most visible and damaging. Drummond picked up his tin cup again. You'd need to either disappear, which would still create the association problem, or deal with it directly, which would involve acknowledging Harlan County publicly, which would create a different kind of problem. Hale has the papers, Elias said. Hale has whatever Daniel wrote down. Briggs has sources, people who were in Harlan County, people who remember. The papers are evidence, but not the only evidence. Drummond looked at him steadily. I'm not saying it's a clean situation. It's not, Elias agreed. He stood. I need to get back to Hale, and I need to get to Rupert Kane before Briggs's people do. Kane knows you're coming? He will, Elias said. He untied Raven and swung up. What do you know about where Pell is? The ranch hand? He came through Blackstone Ridge 2 days ago. I need to know if he delivered what he found to Briggs's people, or if he's still sitting on it, Drummond thought. There's a relay point Briggs uses about 40 miles east of here. Small trading post on the Meridian Road. If Pell was reporting in, he'd go through there. He tilted his head slightly. If you were planning on intercepting something, that would be the road to watch. I'm not planning to intercept anything, Elias said. I'm planning to get ahead of it. He rode through most of the night. It wasn't comfortable and it wasn't smart. Strictly speaking, riding hard in desert dark on a tired horse was the kind of decision that ended badly, often enough that experienced riders avoided it. But the calculation was simple. Every hour that Briggs's people had the Harlan County documentation or confirmation of its existence was an hour of advantage. Elias had spent 11 years being a step behind the things that chased him. He was done with that particular habit. He stopped twice to rest, Raven genuinely stopped. Not the half-stop of a man pretending to rest while his horse suffered, and arrived at the outskirts of the Hale estate in the gray hour before dawn, when the watchmen were at their most tired and the dogs were at their most alert. The dogs announced him before he reached the gate, which was expected. One of the night watchmen came out with a rifle and a lantern, saw who it was, and went back to get Garrett. Garrett came out in his work clothes with the expression of a man who had learned not to be surprised by things, but hadn't entirely stopped being inconvenienced by them. He listened to what Elias told him, all of it. Briggs, Aldridge, Pell, the water rights, Kane without interrupting, his face doing the particular careful work of a man organizing information as it arrived. "Mr. Hale needs to hear this," Garrett said. "I know. Wake him." Garrett looked at him. "It's 4 in the morning. I know what time it is." Garrett considered this for a moment. Then he turned toward the house without further argument, which told Elias something useful about the degree, to which the previous day's conversation had shifted the operation's stance toward him. Hale was up in 15 minutes, dressed incompletely in the way of a man who had put on enough clothes to be decent without taking time to be proper. He listened the way Garrett had listened, quietly, without interruption, and when Elias finished, he sat in the chair by his desk for a moment, with his hands flat on his knees. "Briggs," he said, "you know him. I know of him. We haven't met." Hale's voice had a quality in it that was different from anything Elias had heard from him before. The grief was still there, it didn't go anywhere. It was structural now, but alongside it was something harder and colder. The anger of a man who has realized his brother was used by someone he'd never even confronted. He used Daniel. Yes, Daniel was looking for a way to matter, and this man handed him a direction and a purpose, and Daniel followed it without understanding what he was walking into. "That's what I believe happened," Elias said carefully. Hale stood. He was more present than he'd been even yesterday, more alert, more focused, the grief reorganizing itself from something passive into something that wanted a direction to move. "Judge Farwell sent word this morning before you arrived. I was going to send a rider to Blackstone Ridge." He picked up a paper from the desk. "Aldridge has a formal relationship with a land acquisition company operating out of the north. The company's primary investor is listed as a holding group, but Farwell's contacts put Harlan Briggs behind the holding group." He looked at Elias. "That's your confirmation. Briggs needs to lose his documentation before the water rights proceedings reach their critical stage," Elias said. "And he needs Kane isolated from anyone who might support him, including you, especially me." Hale set the paper down. He looked at Elias with the gray eyes that had assessed him so carefully yesterday and were now doing something different, not assessing but deciding. "What do you need?" Hale asked. It was a question that required a moment because it was the first time in a long time that someone with resources and genuine capacity had asked it and meant it as an offer rather than a test. "I need a letter of introduction to Rupert Kane," Elias said. "Your name carries weight with him, and mine doesn't, not in a formal sense." He paused. "And I need those papers to stay exactly where they are. Don't move them, don't destroy them. If Briggs's people come back for them, I want them to find what they expect to find, and report back that the situation is as they assumed." Hale understood immediately. "You want them to believe the papers are vulnerable." "I want them to stop looking and start assuming," Elias said. "Assuming men make mistakes." Hale moved to his desk and took out paper and pen and began writing. The letter was short. Elias could see that from across the room, a few sentences, nothing elaborate. That was right. An elaborate letter from Victor Hale to Rupert Kane would look calculated. A short one looked like what it was, one serious man vouching for another to a third. He folded it and sealed it and handed it across. "Kane's spread is 12 miles east. You'll find him there, unless he's in town for the proceedings, which aren't scheduled for another 3 weeks." Elias took the letter. He put it in his coat, next to his heart, which was not sentiment, but practicality. It was the place least likely to be disturbed. "There's one more thing," Elias said. "Pell." Hale's expression went flat. "Yes, don't come after him. Not yet. If he goes to ground or disappears, it tells Briggs something moved. Let him report in. Let him tell Briggs whatever he found in your study." He watched Hale's face. "Can you do that?" Hale was silent for a moment that had considerable effort inside it. "That man was in my house," he said. "He was in Daniel's papers." "I know, you're asking me to let him walk." "I'm asking you to let him walk for now," Elias said. "There's a difference. When this is finished, you can deal with Pell however you see fit. But if he disappears now, or if Briggs finds out that we know what we know, the whole thing closes up and goes somewhere else and we start over." Hale held the stillness of a man who was making himself do something difficult by force of will rather than inclination. "All right," he said, "for now." Outside, the desert had begun its transition from black to gray, the slow, cautious lightning that the desert did every morning as if it wasn't quite sure the day was safe yet. Elias could hear the first birds beginning their noise and the cattle in the distant pasture shifting with the coming light. He had a letter in his coat, a name to carry it to, and a shape of something that was not yet finished but was at least visible. That was more than he'd had when he rode into Blackstone Ridge 9 days ago, a man with nothing but a weathered hat and the long habit of surviving the next thing. It wasn't settled. Nothing was settled. But it was moving, and it was moving in a direction that he was choosing rather than simply reacting to. And that distinction, small as it seemed from the outside, was the difference between a man being driven by events and a man driving them. He went to the stable and saddled Raven in the growing light, and she stood steady under his hands the way she always did, patient and present and entirely indifferent to the weight of what he was carrying. He rode east as the sun came up behind him. Rupert Kane's spread looked like the man himself, functional, undecorated, built for duration rather than impression. Elias arrived mid-morning and found Kane in the middle of a disagreement with a fence contractor about post depth, which Kane was losing on the facts but winning on volume. The contractor was a patient man who had apparently weathered this particular argument before. He stood with his hat in his hands and let Kane finish, then quietly explained, again, why the posts needed to go the depth they needed to go. Kane listened with the expression of a man who doesn't like being right when it requires conceding anything. He was 63, built like someone had stacked bricks, and then taught the stack to walk. White hair, a beard that hadn't been trimmed with any particular intention, hands that were so calloused they looked like a different material than skin. He turned from the contractor when he heard Raven's hooves and looked at Elias with the flat, assessing look of a man who'd spent 6 decades deciding quickly whether things were worth his time. "You're Vane," Kane said. "I am. I was wondering when you'd show up." He said it without surprise, without particular welcome. He turned to the contractor. "Go the depth," he said. "And if the posts rot in 5 years, I'm taking it out of the final payment." He walked toward Elias without waiting to see how the contractor received this. "Come inside. You look like you've been riding since before light. Close to it, coffee's on." The inside of Kane's house had the comfortable disorder of a place where one person had lived alone for long enough that the organizational system had become entirely personal and therefore impenetrable to anyone else. There were papers on the kitchen table that had clearly been there for weeks, a saddle that had no obvious reason to be in the hallway, and a dog of indeterminate breed and advanced age sleeping against the far wall, with the total commitment of an animal that had decided its working days were finished. Kane poured coffee into 2 cups that didn't match and sat across from Elias and put Victor Hale's letter on the table without opening it. "I know what it says, more or less," Kane said. "Hale sent a rider ahead of you." Elias hadn't known that. He filed it. Hale was moving faster than expected, which was either a good sign or the sign of a man who decided to take action on his own timeline, regardless of what Elias had asked. "Then you know about Briggs," Elias said. "I know about Briggs," Kane confirmed. He picked up his coffee. "Known about him for 8 months. He's been circling this water dispute like a dog circling a bone. The difference is the dog's honest about what it wants. He's going to try to remove you from the legal proceedings," Elias said. "Through me, through the connection between us." Kane looked at him steadily. "That connection being that my wife's brother had a ranch in Sweetwater that you helped save 7 years ago." "Yes, and that I've talked about it." Kane's jaw shifted. "I talk about it because it's true and because it matters. My brother-in-law would have lost everything without what happened in Sweetwater. His kids would have grown up with nothing." He set his cup down. "I'm not ashamed of saying that. I'm not asking you to be. I'm telling you it's the lever they plan to use." "How?" Elias laid it out the way he'd laid it out for Hale Aldridge. Daniel Hale, the Harlan County documentation. Pell, the break-in. He did it in order, without embellishment, watching Kane's face move through the information with the methodical attention of a man who processed things the way he built fences deliberately, checking each joint before moving to the next. When Elias finished, Kane was quiet for a while. The old dog against the wall shifted in its sleep, legs moving briefly with some interior dream, then went still again. "So they were going to what?" Kane said. "Release this Harlan County business in the middle of the water rights proceedings? Make it look like I was standing behind a compromised man? Make it look like the moral authority behind your challenge was borrowed from someone with something to hide?" "Yes, and is it?" Kane looked at him directly. "Is it borrowed from someone with something to hide?" This was the question that had no comfortable answer, and Elias had known it was coming since he'd ridden out of Hale's estate at dawn. He'd had 12 miles to decide how to answer it, and had arrived at only one conclusion, that the answer had to be the same one he'd given Hale in that study, because the alternative was building the next thing on the same dishonest ground that had already cost him 11 years. "My father was a corrupt man," Elias said. "He used a federal marshal to steal land from families who couldn't fight back legally. I testified against him. He died in custody. I left Kentucky afterward, and I've been going by Elias Vane ever since, which is my name, but not all of it." He paused. "I'm not proud of the name I left behind. I'm not particularly ashamed of it either. What happened in Harlan County I'd do again. What I'd do differently is not spend 11 years pretending it didn't happen." Kane listened to all of this with the same methodical attention. When it was done, he looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Does any of that change what happened in Sweetwater? No. Does it change who you are now? Elias thought about that honestly. It explains some of it, he said. A man doesn't spend 11 years keeping himself separate from everyone around him without a reason. The reason isn't usually flattering. Kane picked up his coffee again. My father was a drunk who lost 3 properties before he died, he said, with the directness of a man who has made his peace with a fact by saying it plainly enough times. I spent 20 years building something he couldn't, and I spent most of those 20 years angry at him for making it necessary. A man's history is just what he came from. What he does with the coming from is the part that matters. He drank. I'm not removing myself from the water rights proceedings. I'm not asking you to. Good. Because Briggs can release whatever he has about you, and it won't change what I've seen with my own eyes. What happened in Sweetwater is what happened. A man either stands behind what he knows or he bends to what he's pressured to say. And I'm 63 years old, and I've got maybe 10 years left where my back cooperates with my intentions, and I'll be damned if I spend any of them bending. He set the cup down. Now, what do we actually do about this? What they did required 3 days of careful arrangement, and Kane turned out to be a man who arranged things with the same methodical energy he brought to fence posts. He had contacts in the territorial capital that Hale didn't, people connected not to the legal and political structure but to the working world that existed beneath it, the clerks and surveyors and small office lawyers who knew where the actual bodies were buried because they'd done some of the burying. Through these contacts, working in parallel with Hale's approach through Judge Farwell, they assembled a picture of Harlan Briggs's land acquisition operation that was considerably more detailed than what Elias had pieced together from Drummond's information. The holding company behind Aldridge had a documented history of the same pattern in 2 other territories, water disputes used as pressure, legal proceedings undermined through reputational attacks, distressed land acquired at cents on the dollar by investors who then controlled access to resources that the remaining landowners needed to survive. It was not illegal in every aspect. That was the design of it. The parts that were illegal were buried under layers of corporate structure and contracted intermediaries, and the parts that were merely predatory were legal enough that the law had no clear avenue in. What they needed was not evidence of the illegal parts that would take years, and a federal apparatus that was not, in the current political climate, reliably inclined to pursue men of Briggs's wealth and connections. What they needed was to remove the leverage, to make the Harlan County documentation worthless as a weapon. The way to make it worthless was to remove the secret. Elias understood this. He had understood it since the conversation with Hale, probably earlier, somewhere in the 12-mile ride east while the sun climbed behind him. A secret derives its power from remaining one. The moment it's spoken openly, by the person it's meant to damage, it becomes just information, true or false, relevant or not, but stripped of the particular power that comes from being something other people know and you don't want them to. He sat with Kane at the kitchen table on the second evening and said, I need to make a statement. Formal, written, witnessed. Kane looked at him. About Harlan County. About all of it. My father, the land theft, the testimony, why I left, the full account. He felt the particular discomfort of saying it out loud to someone other than Hale, a different quality of exposure, more public somehow, more final. If Briggs releases his documentation, I want there to already be a statement on record that says the same things. Filed with the water rights proceedings as background material. Not hidden, not apologized for, just there. It'll be read, Kane said, by people in this territory and outside it, I know. And you've made your peace with that. Elias was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was that he hadn't entirely made his peace with it. Peace implied a settled feeling, and what he felt was something more like grim necessity, the recognition that a door needed opening, and the only one who could open it from the inside was him. But necessity and peace were both ways of moving forward, and he'd run out of patience for standing still. I've made my decision, he said. That's enough. Kane nodded once. I'll have my lawyer come tomorrow morning. He's good and he's discreet, and he understands the stakes. One more thing, Elias said. Pell. Kane waited. He's reported to Briggs by now. Told him whatever he found in Hale's study. Briggs's people will be making their own plan. He looked at Kane steadily. We need to move faster than they expect. The statement filed. Farwell in the Capitol alerted. And Hale's documentation of Aldridge's connection to the Briggs Holding Company submitted to the proceedings simultaneously. All of it at once before they have time to respond. That's a 48-hour window, Kane said. At most. Kane looked at the table for a moment. Then he stood and went to the door and called for his foreman, and the arrangements began. The lawyer's name was Tobias Ware, and he arrived the next morning with a leather case and the slightly harried expression of a man who had been given complicated instructions on short notice and was determined to execute them correctly. He was younger than Elias had expected, late 30s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the careful speech of someone who had trained himself out of a regional accent and into something more formally neutral. He sat across from Elias at Kane's table and asked his questions without flinching, which Elias appreciated. He had expected a certain amount of the delicate handling that people sometimes extended to difficult subjects, and Ware gave him none of it, just direct questions, clear language, and the occasional clarifying follow-up that showed he was listening rather than just recording. The statement took 2 hours to get right. Elias told the full account of Harlan County, his father's operation, the marshal named Corbett, the families who'd lost land, the decision to testify, the trial, his father's death. He told it plainly, in the order it happened, without editorializing and without the self-protective vagueness that he might have reached for in other circumstances. Ware wrote it down and read it back and asked where it needed clarifying, and by the time they were finished, it was a document that said exactly what it needed to say and nothing more. "This will be read," Ware said, "not for the first time." "I know," Elias said, "not for the first time." Ware looked at him over the wire-rimmed glasses with something that might have been professional admiration, or some have been simply the recognition of one person by another, that something was being done with difficulty. "I'll have it filed with the proceedings by end of day. Combined with the Aldridge documentation from Mr. Hale's offices and the submission Judge Farwell is preparing from the Capitol, the record will be comprehensive." "Good," Elias said. He stood and walked to the window and looked out at Kane's yard, where the fence contractor was still working, the posts now going in at the depth that had been argued over 2 days before. The work looked solid. It looked like it would hold. Briggs's response came faster than Elias had anticipated, which meant either that Pell had reported back more quickly than expected, or that Briggs had people watching the legal proceedings more closely than Kane had realized. On the morning of the second day, a rider arrived at Kane's spread, not one of Briggs's people directly, but a man from the office of a territorial legislator named Pryor, who was, according to Kane's contacts, in Briggs's pocket to a degree that made the word pocket insufficient. The rider delivered a letter addressed to Kane that Kane read without expression and passed to Elias. The letter suggested, in the elaborate language of men who have learned to threaten, without using words that could later be read as threats, that certain information had come to the attention of certain parties regarding Mr. Kane's public association with a man whose history in the eastern states was not consistent with the moral character Mr. Kane had represented in his water rights challenge. It further suggested that this information would be a matter of public record in the territorial proceedings within the week, unless Mr. Kane saw fit to reconsider his position. Elias read it twice and handed it back. "They're a day late," Kane said. "They are," Elias said. "Send a reply." Kane's reply was brief. It noted that the information in question was already a matter of public record, filed with the proceedings that morning, along with supplementary documentation regarding the land acquisition activities of certain northern investors and their legal representatives in the territory. It wished the recipients well in their future endeavors. Kane dictated this to Ware, who wrote it without visibly enjoying himself, though his expression suggested some effort was required to maintain this neutrality. The rider took it and left, and Kane sat in his yard in a wooden chair and looked at the fence work going in and didn't say anything for a while. And Elias stood near him and also said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying in that particular moment. Finally, Kane said, "You know this doesn't end it entirely." "No," Elias agreed. "Briggs is not a man who folds because one angle didn't work. He'll find another." "He will," Elias said. "But the next angle won't be me, and it won't be Harlan County." He looked out at the fence work. "I'm not the only thing standing between him and this water source. You are, Hale is, Farwell is, the documentation Ware filed this morning is. I'm one removed piece of leverage that he no longer has." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Elias said. "But it's done. The piece that was mine to do is done." Kane was quiet for a moment. "What will you do now?" Elias thought about this. It was a question he'd been living for 11 years without a satisfying answer, and he wasn't sure the answer had changed. But some of the weight of the question had shifted. "I don't know," he said. "Probably something I don't plan." He paused. "I've got a horse that needs rest and I've been moving for a while. Maybe I stop moving for a bit." "Blackstone Ridge is a reasonable place to stop," Kane said, "for a man who doesn't want to stop somewhere that requires explaining himself." "You think they know me there?" "I think Cody Marsh has told everyone in that town the story about how you didn't kill 3 men when you could have. Twice, probably, with improvement each telling." Kane picked up his coffee from the ground beside the chair. "They know who you are there. That's different from knowing everything about you. And it's more than most places offer." He rode back to Blackstone Ridge 3 days after the filings were confirmed, and the legal proceedings had formally received the combined documentation. Farwell had sent word that the territorial authority was now formally inquiring into Aldridge's relationship with the Briggs Holding Company, which wouldn't move quickly. These things never did, but would move. And the movement itself was enough to make Briggs pull back from immediate action and regroup. It wasn't victory in the clean, decisive sense. It was the kind of outcome that actual situations produced messy at the edges, with loose threads that would need tending, with a man named Briggs still existing somewhere north of all of this, and still possessing the essential character that had driven the whole operation. The water rights proceedings would continue. Kane would fight them the way he fought everything, thoroughly and loudly, and with more persistence than was comfortable for anyone opposing him. Hale would rebuild his estate, his operation, and whatever understanding of his dead brother he was capable of arriving at, which would never be complete and never be without pain. That was how things resolved themselves in reality. Not with the clean closure that men imagined when they were young, and still believed that problems had solutions rather than just different arrangements. Elias understood this better than most. He had spent 11 years running from a version of resolution that didn't exist, looking for the horizon where the past stopped following him, and had slowly, expensively learned that the past didn't stop following, because it was part of him, not a shadow he could outride, but a thread woven into the fabric of what he was. The question was never whether it followed. The question was whether he was the kind of man who understood why it followed, and whether that understanding made him something more useful to the world than a man who just survived things. He thought about his father. He thought about Elias Vane with more complexity than he usually allowed himself, not the simplified version, the corrupt man who deserved what he got, but the more complete version that he'd been edging toward in the conversations of the last week. A man who had found a system that rewarded a certain kind of cleverness and had become skilled at operating within it without examining its cost. A man who had probably loved his son in the insufficient, distorted way that men like that managed love, through proximity and expectation rather than the harder work of actual attention. A man who had died in a federal jail of a fever at 52 years old, which was a bad ending to any life and no less bad for being the result of his own choices. Elias had testified against him because the families losing their land had children, and the children would have no recourse, and he had been 20 years old and capable of providing recourse, and incapable of pretending that this fact didn't exist. That decision had cost him his father, his home, and eventually his name, at least in the form he'd been given it. It had also been the only thing he'd done in his young life that he could look at without revision. You didn't get to choose the circumstances that shaped your character. You only got to choose what you did with the character once it was shaped. That was the thing Elias had spent 11 years failing to articulate to himself and had finally, in the last 2 weeks, been forced to confront directly, that his particular history wasn't a wound to be hidden or a story to be ashamed of, but the raw material of the only person he actually was. Raven came down off the last ridge above Blackstone Ridge, and the town spread below in the afternoon light, small and functional and unremarkable, in the way that most places people actually lived were unremarkable. He sat for a moment on the ridge and looked at it. He had not planned to come back here. He never planned to come back anywhere. But the town sat in the valley below, looking like what it was, a place where people got up every morning and managed their ordinary lives and worried about the price of grain and the health of their animals and whether their children were making decent decisions. And the ordinariness of it felt, in this particular moment, less like something he was passing through than something he was approaching. He rode down. Cody saw him from the livery before he'd reached the main street and was standing at the gate with the controlled energy of someone who had prepared himself not to look too interested. He failed at this comprehensively. "You came back," the boy said. "I told you I might. You told me you didn't know." "That's what I said. This is what happened." Elias dismounted. "Raven needs a real rest. 3 days at least. Good grain, water, and leave her alone except for that." Cody took the reins. "Did it go as it finished?" "Mostly," Elias said. "The part that was mine to finish." Cody absorbed this with the seriousness he brought to most things now, which was the seriousness of a boy who had decided, somewhere in the last several weeks, to pay attention to how things actually worked rather than how stories said they worked. "What about Hale?" "Hale is he's all right," Elias said. "He'll be all right, and the bounty done." Cody nodded. He stood with Raven for a moment, running his hand along her neck the way he'd seen Elias do it, and Raven accepted this with the patience she extended to people she'd decided were acceptable. "Mrs. Finley's been asking after you," Cody said, not looking up. "She didn't say that exactly. She said she was wondering when that room above the store would be needed again." Elias looked at the boy. "When did she say that? Yesterday?" Cody finally looked up. "She's been saying it, different versions of it, for about 4 days." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I'll go talk to her." Ruth Finley was behind the counter when he came in. doing inventory with the focused efficiency of a woman who did everything with focused efficiency. She looked up when the door opened, registered that it was him, and looked back at her inventory. "Rooms available," she said. "Cody told me." Course he did. She made a mark in the ledger. "My husband's better. Not entirely, but he's up and moving, which is an improvement." She made another mark. "He wants to meet you, I'd be willing. He's going to ask you about Sweetwater. He always does with anyone who was there." "That's all right." She looked up then, fully in the direct way she had. "The man who was watching Nathan Creel. He came through again 2 days ago." So to tell the situation on Hale's end was stable, and that Voss had been formally stood down. She paused. He seemed like a man delivering news he was glad to deliver. "Nathan's all right," Elias said. He also said, she stopped, "made a decision about something. He said to tell you that Donnie came back to Hale's estate last week. Voluntarily returned his payment and said he was done with that kind of work." She held Elias's gaze. "I don't know if that means anything to you." It did. It meant more than he'd have admitted easily. It meant that the choice he'd given Donnie in the Lucky Spur, the invitation to stop, wrapped in the form of a question rather than a command, had continued working in the young man's interior long after the moment had passed. That was not a small thing. That was in some ways the thing he was least certain he'd earned. He thought about what he'd said to Donnie that afternoon. "You want to go home tonight. You want to wake up tomorrow." He'd said it as strategy, as a way of finding the lever that would diffuse the situation. But strategy and truth weren't always different things. And sometimes the truest thing you said was the thing you said's in the urgency of trying to survive. "It means something," he said. Ruth nodded and went back to her inventory. Then, without looking up, "The room's $2 a week. Same as before." "That's fair," Elias said. He went upstairs. The room was the same small room with the same adequate bed and the same window that looked out over the main street of Blackstone Ridge. He sat on the edge of the bed and took off his hat and set it on the table and looked at the ceiling for a while. 11 years was a long time to carry a thing. It left marks the way carrying anything left marks not just on the hands but in how you stood, in how much you trusted the ground under your feet, in the particular distance you maintained between yourself and everything that might require you to stay. He was 41 years old. He had a horse that trusted him, a room above a store run by a practical woman who didn't ask more of him than he could give, and a name that was his own, even if it had once felt borrowed. He had, somewhere in the last several weeks, told the truth about himself to 3 different people and survived the telling each time, which was a fact that he was still getting used to and expected would take time to fully absorb. He had also made enemies of Harlan Briggs, which was not a trivial thing and would require attention. Briggs was not finished. Kane had been right about that, and a man of Briggs's resources and character did not forget the instruments that had disrupted his operations. Elias would need to be careful. He had always been careful, but there was a difference between the carefulness of a man hiding and the carefulness of a man who was visible and knew it. The second kind was harder, and he suspected better. He thought about Daniel Hale one more time. The man on the floor of a Cutter's Ford saloon, 38 years old, carrying 6 months of someone else's agenda and a lifetime of his brother's shadow, and enough whiskey to turn both into something that looked, from a certain angle, like purpose. He had looked at Elias across a crowded room and said, "You think I don't know what you are," and had been right. In a way he couldn't have fully understood. Elias hadn't known what he was either, not completely. Not in the way that required saying it out loud to people who mattered. He knew better now. That wasn't the same as knowing it all. He was under no illusion that the last several weeks had resolved him into a simpler or cleaner person than he'd been before. The same history was still in him. The same instincts toward distance, toward silence, toward keeping himself positioned near the exit. These things didn't vanish because you named them. They just became, in the naming, something you carried consciously rather than unconsciously, and conscious carrying was different work. Harder in some ways, less exhausting in others. What he'd learned or relearned, or finally let himself believe was something that the frontier had a way of teaching, and then taking back and then teaching again, over and over, until either you died or it stayed with you. That the things you'd done in your past were not separate from you, they were you. And the question was never whether to carry them, but whether you'd carry them in a way that made you useful, or in a way that made you diminished. That the men who survived the longest were not always the fastest or the most dangerous, but the ones who understood what they were willing to die for and what they weren't, and kept those 2 categories honest. That the world was not divided into good men and bad men, but into men trying to be the better version of themselves, and men who'd stopped trying, and the distance between those 2 categories was sometimes very small and sometimes infinite, and you couldn't always tell which from the outside. And that silence, for all its uses, was not the same as strength. He had confused the 2 for a long time. Real strength was the thing he'd done in Hale's study. at Kane's kitchen table, in front of Tobias Ware's careful questions. It was the thing that required you to be present in a room rather than just occupying it, to let what you'd done and what you were be visible to people who might use it against you or might simply know you better for it. He hadn't figured all of this out cleanly. He suspected he never would. That was all right. Clean figuring was for situations that deserved it, and the life he had was not that kind of situation. It was the ordinary, complicated, continuing kind, and he was still in it, which was what mattered. He put his hat back on his head. Downstairs, he could hear the street beginning its evening transition, the sounds changing quality as the day's work wound down, and the town shifted toward the slower rhythms of after supper. Somewhere below, Ruth Finley was still at her inventory. In the livery, Cody was giving Raven exactly the care he'd been asked to give, with probably some additional conversation that Raven was tolerating with her customary dignity. He went down the stairs and out into the street, where the light was going golden long, the way it did in the desert in the hour before dark, making everything look slightly more than what it was. The town moved around him, people finishing their days, calling to each other across the street, a wagon making its last delivery of the evening. Nobody looked at him with the particular wariness they'd had when he first arrived. A few people nodded. One man whose name he didn't know yet raised a hand in the passing gesture of neighbors. Elias Vane stood in the main street of Blackstone Ridge in the going gold light of early evening, and did not feel safe exactly. He had been in this life too long to confuse the feeling of safety with the fact of it. But he felt, for the first time in longer than he could cleanly locate, something that was not a plan or a strategy or a defensive position. He felt like someone who had somewhere to be. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was just a small, quiet, badly overdue thing, standing in a desert town at the end of a long day, watching the ordinary life of ordinary people go about its business, and finding that he was in it rather than passing through it. Raven was in the livery. The room upstairs was paid for. Ruth Finley's husband wanted to ask him about Sweetwater, and Elias found that he didn't mind answering. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, it always did. But for the first time in 11 years, he wasn't already looking past tomorrow at whatever came after, calculating the exit, measuring the distance between where he stood and where he could run. He was just here. And for now, that was enough.